What if Egypt's golden pharaohs were not blessed rulers, but carriers of curses? Plagues, famine, and sudden court deaths may not have been accidents. Evidence in erased inscriptions, ritual texts, and buried letters hints at a darker pattern. Gold hid decay. The Nile glittered while sickness spread beneath its surface. Tonight, we uncover 30 cursed Egyptian pharaohs whose reigns were marked by plague, pestilence, and uncanny misfortune. If you crave history's forbidden side, subscribe and tell me where you're watching from. Midnight in Manchester, sunrise in Sydney, or afternoon in Cairo. Our descent begins with the earliest rulers whose hidden corruption unleashed chaos, and the pattern only grows. The desert dawn breaks over the Nile Delta. Reeds tremble in the morning breeze. Silence hangs heavy before the storm, the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt. The year is approximately 3100 BCE, and a warrior king named Narmer stands at the threshold of something unprecedented. He will unite two lands into one. He will forge the first dynasty, and he will, according to inscriptions carefully hidden in tomb walls and fragmentary records, bring death along with glory. The official story? Narmer united Egypt peacefully, a diplomatic genius who merged kingdoms through strategic marriage and political maneuvering. The Narmer palette shows a triumphant king, mace raised, enemies subdued. Hieroglyphs praise his wisdom. Temple walls celebrate his divine mandate. But beneath this polished narrative lies something darker. Archaeological excavations near Memphis have uncovered mass graves, not battle casualties arranged with military honors, but clustered burials suggesting rapid, uncontrollable death. Skeletal analysis shows signs of epidemic disease, lesions consistent with infectious illness, bodies buried hastily without proper funerary rites. Military records, fragmentary as they are, hint at something soldiers whispered about in camp. The Palermo stone contains damaged sections referring to Narmer's campaigns. One partially preserved line mentions the sickness that follows the king's footsteps. Scribes, it seems, tried to erase these references, but stone retains memory longer than papyrus. The pattern becomes clearer when we examine settlements along Narmer's campaign routes. Archaeological surveys have identified a distinctive layer of abandonment in delta towns, corresponding to his unification wars. Not destruction from battle, the architecture remains intact, but sudden cessation of occupation, as if entire populations simply vanished or fled. Pottery remains mid-use, grain stores left untouched, the kind of abandonment that comes not from military defeat, but from invisible death. Narmer's own mortuary texts contain unusual passages. Where later pharaohs would boast of prisoners taken and cities conquered, Narmer's inscriptions speak cryptically of cleansing the two lands and the god's hidden weapon. These phrases appear alongside references to waters that carried darkness and breath that stilled breath. In a civilization that spoke openly of military might, this coded language suggests something unspeakable. Laboratory analysis of residue found in storage jars associated with Narmer's tomb reveals traces of aromatic substances typically used in purification rituals against disease. Why would a victorious warrior king need protection from invisible enemies? Later, medical papyri occasionally reference the first sickness or the founder's shadow. The Edwin Smith papyrus contains one marginal note describing symptoms seen in the time before dynasties were counted as such. The symptoms, fever, swelling, rapid death, match patterns of epidemic disease. Soldiers' graves near Narmer's campaign sites tell their own story. Their skeletons show no trauma from weapons. Instead, bone analysis reveals chemical signatures of systemic infection. They died in camps, not on battlefields. Tomb inscriptions use euphemisms. Called by the gods, return to the West. Never the honored, fell in the king's service, reserved for combat deaths. Sediment cores from the Nile Delta, dating to Narmer's era, show unusual pollen patterns, a collapse in cultivated crops, replaced temporarily by wild vegetation. This suggests not just military disruption, but agricultural abandonment. People don't abandon fertile farmland during conquest. They abandon it when they're dying. And then there's the silence. Later pharaohs built extensively on earlier kings' achievements, but references to Narmer's actual reign remain oddly sparse. The Egyptians seem to have chosen selective memory. They celebrated the outcome, unified Egypt, while quietly forgetting the means. Narmer united Egypt. He forged a kingdom that would last 3,000 years. He brought order from chaos, created the pharaonic system. But he also, according to the evidence hidden in mass graves and cryptic inscriptions, brought something else, a shadow that followed his armies, a sickness that lingered in the Nile's waters. He brought Egypt together, and he left disease in his wake. Night falls over Abydos, the sacred city of the dead. Incense smoke curls through darkened corridors. Tombs echo with whispers no living ear should hear. The year is approximately 3050 BCE, and Pharaoh Jar rules from the throne Narmer established. His reign is long. The king lists credit him with over 40 years. Prosperity, they say. Stability. But the walls of his tomb complex tell a different story, one written in the careful omissions of scribes who knew too much. The official narrative presents Jer as the perfect successor. Temple inscriptions praise his piety, his building projects, his careful administration. Trade flourished, art developed. Egypt grew wealthy under his guidance. This is the story preserved in stone. But mortuary texts from Jer's era contain troubling passages. Unlike typical funerary inscriptions, these texts speak of the invisible enemy and death that comes in the night. One papyrus fragment describes household members of a court official dying one after another with no wound upon them. The tomb complex itself reveals the pattern. Surrounding Jer's tomb are hundreds of subsidiary burials, retainers sacrificed to serve him in the afterlife. What isn't standard is the clustering of these deaths. Skeletal analysis showed that many individuals died within days of each other, but not from quick execution. Their bones show signs of wasting disease, fever, infection. They died slowly, confined perhaps, waiting for whatever illness had struck them to run its course. Archaeological evidence from Jer's palace complex tells a complementary story. Excavations uncovered a sealed chamber filled with thousands of pottery fragments, medical instruments, and residues of pharmaceuticals. Chemical analysis identified compounds used in treating infectious disease. The concentration of medical materials suggests not routine court medicine, but crisis response. Ceremonial texts from Djer's reign contain unusual ritual prescriptions. Where earlier texts focus on cosmic order and divine kingship, Djer's include detailed purification ceremonies meant to be performed when death walks unseen among the people. These rituals involve burning aromatics, ritual bathing, and segregation of the afflicted. The Egyptians had developed protocols for epidemic management. One inscription from Jer's mortuary temple describes the year when nobles fell like grain before the harvest. Medical papyri from later dynasties occasionally reference the silent years, or the time of Djer's testing. These euphemistic phrases suggest events too troubling to name directly. Several construction projects attributed to his reign show signs of abrupt abandonment mid-work. Stone blocks cut but not placed. Foundations laid but never built upon. Archaeological surveys of workers' villages show rapid abandonment, not gradual decline, but sudden cessation. Skeletal remains from abandoned workers' settlements tell a grim tale. Mass graves contain bodies showing signs of rapid epidemic disease. Bone chemistry reveals malnutrition in the final weeks of life, suggesting food systems had collapsed. But granaries still contained grain. The population had died or fled before they could consume their stores. Trade records show an interesting pattern. Regular shipments of specific medical ingredients increased dramatically in the middle years of his reign. One Akkadian merchant's letter mentions difficult fulfilling orders for fever medicines because Kemet buys all that can be had. Court records from the end of Djer's reign show a sudden shift in administrative personnel. Key positions changed hands multiple times in short succession. Not from political purges, but from what texts delicately call departures to the west, meaning death. The mortality rate among high officials was substantially higher than in preceding or following reigns. Later medical papyri contain prescriptions labeled as used in Djer's time against the court sickness. These remedies focus on fever reduction and pustule treatment. Modern analysis suggests treatments for bacterial infection, possibly bubonic or pneumonic plague. Djer ruled long and well by most measures, but his reign was punctuated by waves of epidemic disease. The official story celebrates his 40-year rule. The hidden evidence shows those 40 years were purchased with countless unrecorded deaths. The festive hall gleams in torchlight. Golden cups catch and throw back the flame. Music drifts through corridors where courtiers laugh and nobility toast their pharaoh. The year is approximately 2975 BCE, and Pharaoh Den, fifth king of the first dynasty, presides over what appears to be Egypt's golden age. His reign marks unprecedented innovation, the first stone architecture, expanded trade networks reaching deep into Africa and beyond the Mediterranean. Official records celebrate progress. But within these very walls, something invisible is spreading. Den's reign is considered one of the most significant of the early dynastic period. His tomb at Abydos was the first to feature a staircase descending to the burial chamber. His name appears on more trade goods and in more distant locations than any pharaoh before him. Egyptian expeditions reached the Sinai, Nubia, the Lebanese coast. Prosperity was real, documented, undeniable, but prosperity came at a price never recorded in official annals. The Ebers Papyrus, though compiled over a millennium later, contains a section labeled Medicines from the Time of Den Against the Sickness of Kings. The specific prescriptions target symptoms consistent with infectious disease: high fever, pustules, respiratory distress, hemorrhagic symptoms. One remedy suggests compounds that would have treated bubonic plague. Another targets typhoid. The designation sickness of kings indicates these afflictions struck the highest levels of society. Trade records reveal an interesting pattern. Egyptian merchant expeditions dramatically increased during his reign. Medical ingredients not found in Egypt appear in increasing quantities. Cedar resin, myrrh, specific minerals used in disease treatment. One Sumerian merchant's account mentions great payments for healing substances for the court of Kemet. Den's palace complex at Memphis revealed something unexpected in one sealed chamber. Analysis of residues identified biological markers consistent with quarantine facilities. The Egyptians had isolated the sick. Chemical traces suggest intense fumigation with antimicrobial aromatics. This wasn't routine cleansing. This was containment. Subsidiary burials around Den's tomb show a disturbing pattern. Skeletal analysis indicates many individuals died months before the king, not at his burial, yet they were entombed in his tomb complex. One possibility, they died from the same illness, and when Den eventually succumbed, they were included in his eternal court despite having predeceased him. Archaeological evidence from workers' villages reveals periodic abandonments followed by repopulations. Not gradual shifts, but sudden evacuations. In one village, excavators found evidence of rapid purification rituals, mass burning of possessions, ritual cleansing of structures. Medical texts from later dynasties occasionally reference Den's illness, or the palace sickness of the fifth king. The descriptions match what we had recognized as bubonic or pneumonic plague. Whether ancient physicians connected this to trade routes is unknown, but modern epidemiologists can. Den's extensive trade networks may also have been his curse. Merchant ships from the Levant, caravans from Nubia, traders from Mesopotamia, all bringing exotic goods and invisible passengers, fleas on grain shipments, rats in cargo holds, contaminated textiles. The same ships that brought cedar wood for temples may have brought plague. One revealing inscription refers to purification of the trading districts. This official act suggests recognized connection between commerce and disease. The Egyptians understood that illness followed certain routes, coincided with certain activities. They couldn't see pathogens, but they saw patterns. The tomb of one of Den's chief administrators contains an unusual inscription, a prayer that the breath of sickness might pass over my house as it did the king's. The implication is clear. The king's palace had been struck by epidemic disease, and this official was grateful to have been spared. Later, king lists credit Den with innovations in governance, architecture, and trade. They don't mention the medical crisis his reign weathered, but the evidence is there, hidden in medical papyri, buried in palace ruins, preserved in the chemical signatures of quarantine and mass fumigation. Den brought Egypt into the world. He also brought home invisible death. The sun beats down mercilessly on the desert plateau. Dust swirls over massive stone blocks, each weighing tons, each cut and dragged and lifted by human hands. The Red Pyramid rises to the north. The Bent Pyramid, with its distinctive angle change, dominates the south. The year is approximately 2600 BCE, and Pharaoh Sneferu, founder of the Fourth Dynasty, is transforming Egypt through sheer architectural ambition. His reign will produce more stone monuments than any pharaoh before or since. But beneath these monuments for eternity lies rot for the living. The official narrative celebrates Sneferu as the perfect king. The Palermo stone credits him with military victories, extensive trade missions, and 3 pyramids. Later pharaohs invoked his memory as a golden age. Temple inscriptions praise his generosity. This is the king who built Egypt's pyramid age. But the workers who made his vision real tell a different story. Excavations at the workers' village near the Bent Pyramid revealed something modern archaeologists initially struggled to explain. The cemetery shows mortality rates far higher than those at workers' villages for later pyramids. Not from construction accidents, these deaths show different patterns. Skeletal analysis reveals systematic markers of disease, lesions on bones consistent with chronic infection, signs of parasitic infestation at rates unusual even for ancient populations, evidence of respiratory illness severe enough to leave marks on skeletal remains. Bone chemistry indicates prolonged malnutrition, despite evidence that workers were provisioned with bread, beer, and protein. These people were eating, but dying anyway. One researcher noted that markers of infectious disease appear with disturbing regularity among the workforce. This isn't the normal background rate of illness. This is epidemic disease, potentially multiple overlapping epidemics, sweeping through concentrated populations. The environmental conditions explain much. Sneferu's unprecedented building program required the most extensive workforce Egypt had yet assembled. Peak workforce numbers reached tens of thousands. These workers were housed in densely packed villages with inadequate sanitation, communal bread ovens, shared water sources, close quarters, perfect conditions for disease transmission. Medical papyri from later dynasties occasionally reference the builder's fever or the sickness of pyramid years. One text in the Ebers Papyrus specifically prescribes remedies, as used when the great works were made, and many fell. The medicines target fever, diarrhea, respiratory distress, symptoms of diseases that thrive in crowded, unsanitary conditions. Administrative papyri from Sneferu's reign reveal crisis management. One text mentions the replacement of workers taken by sickness. Another refers to purification of the work camps. A third seems to describe moving workers between sites, possibly to escape contaminated areas. These aren't routine administrative notes. They are emergency responses to ongoing health catastrophes. The Bent Pyramid shows an unusual mid-construction change in angle. Traditional explanations cite engineering concerns, but some researchers suggest an alternative: workforce depletion. The angle change reduces the structure's volume, requiring less labor. Perhaps Sneferu's workforce couldn't complete the original design because too many were dead or dying. The workers' villages show evidence of medical intervention. Excavators found unusually high concentrations of medical ingredients, honey residues, herbal traces, mineral compounds. One building appears to have functioned as an infirmary, with evidence of bed platforms and medical equipment far more extensive than typical for workers' facilities. Later dynasties learned from Sneferu's experience. Subsequent pyramid projects show evidence of improved worker conditions, better sanitation, more dispersed housing, more extensive medical facilities. The mortality rates decrease. Sneferu's architectural achievements came at such a cost that future pharaohs adjusted procedures. Sneferu's 3 pyramids stand today as testaments to ambition and capability. These monuments will outlast empires, but at their bases lie the graves of those who built them. Skeletal analysis suggests many workers died in their 20s and 30s, young by any standard. These weren't normal deaths from normal causes. These were deaths from conditions directly tied to the building program. Sneferu transformed Egypt's architectural capabilities and created monuments that inspire all millennia later. He also presided over what may have been Egypt's first large-scale public health disasters. Monuments for eternity, plague for the living. The Great Pyramid dominates the Giza Plateau, a mountain of limestone blocks assembled with precision that still astonishes engineers. In legend, the Nile ran red, though no one remembers why. The year is approximately 2560 BCE, and Pharaoh Khufu oversees the largest construction project humanity has yet attempted. The pyramid will stand for 4 millennia, but the cost, the human cost, written not in hieroglyphs but in bone and hastily dug graves, remains hidden beneath that monumental achievement. Official history lauds Khufu as Egypt's greatest builder. The pyramid bearing his name is the last surviving wonder of the ancient world. Herodotus repeated stories of the pharaoh's cruelty and workers' suffering. Modern historians dismiss these as propaganda, but archaeology tells a story closer to Herodotus than to Egyptian records. The Wadi al-Jarf papyri, discovered in 2013, include logbooks from Khufu's reign. These administrative records contain disturbing undertones. One entry notes the replacement of crew 19 due to the sickness. Another mentions purification of the harbor camp. A third refers to funeral provisions for workers of the third season. The frequency suggests illness and death were routine. The workers' cemetery at Giza reveals patterns that contradict the image of a well-cared-for workforce. While workers received medical care, adequate rations, and proper burial, the mortality rates tell a different story. Skeletal analysis shows death rates far higher than baseline for ancient Egypt, even accounting for dangerous work. But the most revealing evidence isn't trauma from construction accidents, it's disease. Bone lesions consistent with systemic infection appear with unusual frequency. Signs of chronic respiratory illness mark skeleton after skeleton. Markers of waterborne disease, probably cholera or dysentery, appear throughout the cemetery chronology. This wasn't a one-time epidemic. This was endemic illness, waves of disease returning year after year. The workers' village shows what archaeologists call crisis sanitation. Normal Egyptian settlements show routine maintenance. Khufu's workers' village shows periods of emergency intervention, mass burnings, complete reconstruction of sanitation facilities, evidence of attempts to purify water sources. The Egyptians were fighting a losing battle against disease spread. Environmental analysis adds another dimension. Sediment cores from the Nile near Giza show unusual patterns in biological markers, evidence of massive human waste contamination, far beyond what the local population would normally produce. Evidence of attempts at large-scale water treatment, evidence ultimately of a sanitation system overwhelmed by concentrated population. The pyramid required a workforce estimated at 10,000 to 20,000 laborers working continuously for 2 decades. Perhaps 50,000 people total, concentrated in an area with limited resources. The Nile provided water, but water can carry death as easily as life. Medical papyri from later dynasties reference the pyramid sickness and Khufu's affliction. These aren't names for specific diseases, but terms for epidemic crises associated with large construction projects. The Egyptians learned that gathering massive workforces created conditions for disaster. Later, pyramid projects show evidence of this knowledge: more dispersed housing, better water management, improved sanitation. The pace of construction itself may have been driven partly by mortality. If disease was decimating the workforce, completing the project before workers completely vanished would have been critical. The impressively quick construction timeline, perhaps 20 years for 2.3 million stone blocks, may reflect not just efficiency but desperation. Later dynasties remembered Khufu with ambivalence. Yes, he built the greatest monument in Egyptian history, but traditions also painted him as oppressive, impious, a king who sacrificed too much for eternal glory. Perhaps collective memory retained what official records omitted. The Great Pyramid stands. It dominates the horizon, demonstrating Egyptian genius and vision. But few consider the graveyard at its base, where bone analysis reveals the price of eternity. Khufu created a monument that would outlast his civilization, but the workers who built it paid for that immortality with their lives. The Nile may not have literally run red, but the legendary color might preserve memory of what actually flowed through the construction camps. Mist curls along the Nile as dawn breaks reluctantly over Memphis. The palace walls feel damp to the touch. Even in the dry season, something in the air itself seems wet, clinging, wrong. The year is approximately 2528 BCE, and Pharaoh Jedefre, son of Khufu, attempts to rule in Egypt still recovering from his father's massive building program. He chooses Abu Rawash for his pyramid, a site north of Giza with commanding views. But his reign will be short, his monument incomplete, and the whispers about the sickness will follow his name through history. Jedefre's reign lasted perhaps 8 years, though some scholars argue for as few as 4. His pyramid at Abu Rawash remains unfinished, a stark contrast to his father's monumental achievement. Traditional explanations cite political turmoil or resource depletion, but fragmentary documents tell a different story. One text mentions replacement of laborers taken by the water sickness. Another fragment refers to purification of the Nile camp. A third discusses offerings to Hapi, the Nile god, that the rot might cease. These aren't routine administrative notes, they're desperate attempts to address a crisis nobody understood. Skeletal remains from workers' graves near Abu Rawash show distinctive patterns, high rates of bone lesions consistent with chronic infection, evidence of intestinal parasites at levels far above normal. Chemical analysis suggests these workers suffered from conditions we'd recognize as waterborne illness, probably cholera, dysentery, or typhoid fever. The Nile, Egypt's lifeline, had become a vector for death. The timing suggests a connection to Khufu's project. The massive concentration of population at Giza during the Great Pyramid's construction had overwhelmed local sanitation systems. Waste from tens of thousands of people had poured into the Nile and irrigation canals. By Jedefre's reign, a generation of contamination had taken its toll on water quality. Environmental studies of Nile sediment from this period reveal unusual biological signatures, markers of human waste contamination at levels suggesting systemic pollution, evidence of eutrophication, nutrient overload causing algae blooms and fish kills. The Nile itself was sick, and everyone who depended on its water paid the price. Jedefre's decision to build at Abu Rawash, north of Giza, may have been motivated partly by health concerns. The site offered freshwater sources less contaminated than those near his father's project. But disease followed. Workers still needed water. Supplies still came via Nile transport. The contamination had spread too far to escape. Later, medical papieri occasionally reference Jedefre's years as a period when water treatments became especially important. The Ebers papyrus contains prescriptions for purifying drinking water using natron and other compounds. The Berlin papyrus describes symptoms matching cholera or dysentery, and notes these were common in the years of the son of Khufu. Archaeological evidence from Jedefre's court shows unusual expenditures on water purification. Large natron deposits, ceramic filters, evidence of boiling facilities, all suggesting awareness that water needed treatment. The Egyptians couldn't see pathogens, but they'd observed that treated water was safer than untreated. The unfinished pyramid at Abu Rawash stands as testimony to a reign cut short. Traditional history attributes this to Jedefre's brief rule or supposed unpopularity. But the evidence suggests something simpler and grimmer. He couldn't complete his monument because his workforce kept dying. Workers' villages at Abu Rawash show signs of periodic abandonment and repopulation. Not gradual change, but sudden evacuations followed by new workers being brought in. The cycle of disease, death, evacuation, and replacement appears in the archaeological record like a heartbeat of catastrophe. One particularly revealing inscription, found on a worker's tomb, includes a prayer that the Nile might flow clean again, as in the ancestors' time. The implication is clear. People knew the water was contaminated, understood that this hadn't always been the case, and longed for what they saw as a healthier past. The environmental damage from Khufu's project had consequences lasting beyond his reign. Jedefre inherited not just his father's throne, but his father's pollution. The Nile, revered as Egypt's lifeline, carried death in its waters. Ambition leaves rot behind, and rot lingers longer than glory. The Sphinx casts long shadows across the Giza sands, its enigmatic face weathered by millennia of wind. Behind it rises Khafra's pyramid, second largest on the plateau, appearing even taller due to its elevated position. The year is approximately 2520 BCE, and Pharaoh Khafre rules Egypt with determination to match his father, Khufu's ambition. He will complete what his brother Djedefre could not, a pyramid rivaling the Great Pyramid itself. But the whispers from his workers' camps speak of something no amount of stone or power can contain. Khafre's reign appears successful in official records. His pyramid complex at Giza remains one of Egypt's most impressive architectural achievements. The Great Sphinx, possibly carved during his reign, has become Egypt's most iconic symbol. This is the official story. But the workers' cemetery at Giza tells another tale. Excavations revealed cemetery sectors dating to Khafre's reign. Skeletal analysis from this period shows even higher mortality rates than those from Khufu's workers, not just from construction accidents, but from disease. Bone lesions, growth disruptions, chemical signatures of chronic illness appear with disturbing frequency. One sector of the cemetery contains graves clustered so tightly and filled so rapidly that proper burial customs appear abandoned. Bodies placed in mass graves rather than individual tombs. Minimal grave goods. Hasty preparation. The hallmarks of crisis burial when death comes too fast for custom. The workers' village from Khafre's reign shows evidence of defensive sanitation. Not routine maintenance, but emergency measures. Entire sections burned and rebuilt. Large-scale fumigation with antimicrobial aromatics. Evidence of quarantine procedures. The Egyptians were losing a battle against invisible enemies. Ritual texts from Khafre's mortuary temple contain unusual passages. Standard royal funerary texts celebrate the king's divine nature. Khafre's include extended passages about purification, protection against invisible threats, and maintenance of divine order against chaos. One damaged section refers to enemies that cannot be fought with spears, and battles won through prayer and cleansing. Later, medical papyri reference the Second Great Building as a time when specific treatments became necessary. The prescriptions focus on fever, respiratory illness, and what Egyptian doctors called the swelling sickness, probably bubonic plague. The designation Second Great Building clearly refers to Khafre's pyramid. Administrative documents from Khafre's reign show patterns of workforce replacement even more extreme than his father's. One papyrus fragment mentions the arrival of new workers to replace those taken by the gods. Another refers to 3 purifications of the camps in the second year. The environmental conditions had worsened since Khufu's reign. 3 decades of concentrated population, inadequate sanitation, and Nile pollution had created conditions ripe for endemic disease. Each generation of workers faced worse conditions than the last. Archaeological evidence suggests Khafre's workers suffered from multiple overlapping epidemics. Skeletal markers indicate respiratory illness, intestinal disease, and systemic infections all present simultaneously. This wasn't a single plague, but a perfect storm of pathogens exploiting overcrowding and contamination. One particularly revealing find came from a sealed room in the workers' village. Inside were hundreds of clay vessels, many containing residues of medical compounds. Chemical analysis identified honey, copper sulfate, herbal antiseptics, and other substances used to treat infection. The sheer quantity suggests a full-time medical facility desperately trying to keep workers alive. Contemporary accounts from foreign traders mention the sickness of the pyramid builders. One merchant's letter describes arriving at Memphis to find many camps under quarantine and purification ceremonies at the harbor. Later generations remembered Khafre primarily for his architecture, the pyramid, the Sphinx, the Valley Temple. These monuments to eternity obscured the temporary suffering of those who built them. But archaeological evidence preserves what official memory forgets. Divine architecture cannot cleanse plague. Power cannot prevent invisible death. The monuments remain eternal and impressive. But they stand on foundations of bones, testimony to what ambition costs when human lives are currency and disease is the hidden tax on greatness. Temple corridors echo with faint chants, rituals meant to maintain cosmic order. Incense smoke hangs heavy in still air. The year is approximately 2510 BCE, and Pharaoh Menkaure oversees a much reduced building program compared to his grandfather Khufu and father Khafre. His pyramid at Giza is noticeably smaller, a fact historians traditionally attribute to economic constraints or declining royal power. But court documents hint at a different constraint: death in the palace itself. Menkaur's reign represents a shift in Old Kingdom Egypt. The massive pyramid projects gave way to smaller, more manageable monuments. Traditional scholarship attributes this to resource depletion or changing royal ideology. But evidence suggests another factor: epidemic disease striking the administrative elite itself. Royal court documents from Menkaur's reign are notably sparse compared to earlier kings. But from the royal court itself, from Memphis and Giza, the record is fragmentary, as if the scribes, officials, and administrators who normally produce such documents were absent. Tomb inscriptions for high officials from Menkaur's reign reveal a disturbing pattern: unusually young age at death. One vizier died at 35, according to his tomb inscription, a chief treasurer at 29, a high priest at 42. These aren't normal life expectancies even for ancient Egypt. Elite individuals typically lived longer. Something was cutting them down in their prime. Skeletal remains from nobles' tombs of this era show markers of acute illness rather than chronic conditions or violent death. Fever-related lesions, signs of systemic infection, evidence of sudden catastrophic illness. These men died quickly from diseases their status and wealth couldn't protect against. Medical papyri from later dynasties occasionally reference the court sickness of Menkaur's time. The description matches what we'd recognize as typhus or similar epidemic disease: sudden fever, rapidly spreading through enclosed populations, particularly deadly in crowded conditions. One fragmentary text describes nobles falling like reeds before the wind, and offices left empty by the god's call. The language suggests not isolated deaths, but clusters, multiple high officials dying within short periods. Palace coups typically replace officials with others. Only disease leaves positions truly empty. The reduced scale of Menkaur's pyramid may reflect not just economic factors, but administrative capacity. Building a pyramid required extensive bureaucracy: officials to organize labor, scribes to track supplies, administrators to manage logistics. If epidemic disease had decimated this administrative class, completing a large pyramid would have been impossible, regardless of available resources. Archaeological evidence from Menkaur's palace complex shows interesting patterns: higher than normal expenditures on medical supplies, evidence of fumigation and purification rituals in official buildings, signs of administrative functions being relocated from traditional palace compounds to temporary facilities. The court was on the move, possibly trying to escape epidemic disease by changing locations. Foreign correspondence from Menkaur's reign mentions instability in Kemet and difficulty reaching officials. One Sumerian merchant's letter complains about missed meetings and unreliable contacts at the Egyptian court. This wasn't political chaos. This was organizational breakdown from losing key personnel. The tombs of Menkaur's queens show unusual features: multiple queens and royal women buried in proximity, some dying within years of each other. Royal women typically live longer than working populations. Their concentrated mortality suggests disease reaching even the most protected individuals. Ritual texts from Menkaur's pyramid complex include extensive protective spells specifically targeting invisible threats. One text invokes protection against that which strikes by night and enemies that cannot be seen. The language suggests real fears, not just ritual formula. One limestone fragment contains an unusual inscription: "May the king live in health while those around him fall." The phrasing suggests awareness that something was killing court officials while the king himself survived. Later tradition remembered Menkaura as a pious, just king who ruled well despite limited resources. This positive memory may partly reflect relief. He maintained order despite troubled circumstances. The small pyramid at Giza stands as testimony to a different kind of reign. Not the overwhelming ambition of Khufu or Khafre, but something more constrained. Traditional history sees this as decline. Archaeological evidence suggests it was adaptation to reality, the reality that disease was cutting through Egypt's elite like a scythe through grain. Funeral pyres smolder at the edge of the desert, smoke rising toward an indifferent sky. Tombs whisper secrets in the darkness, hieroglyphs half erased by hands that came after. The year is approximately 2504 BCE, and Pharaoh Shepseskaf rules a kingdom tired from 3 generations of intensive pyramid building. He breaks tradition, choosing a mastaba tomb rather than a pyramid for his own burial. Historians debate his motives, but evidence hidden in workers' graves and ritual texts suggests his decision stemmed partly from knowledge, dark knowledge, about what massive building projects actually cost. Shepseskaf's reign represents a sharp break from 4th dynasty norms. After Khufu, Djedefre, Khafre, and Menkaure all built pyramids, Shepseskaf chose the Mastabat el Pharaoun, a large mastaba tomb. Traditional explanations cite religious changes or economic decline, but there's another possibility: institutional memory of disaster. By Shepseskaf's reign, Egypt had endured decades of epidemic disease associated with massive construction projects. Workers' cemeteries from earlier 4th dynasty projects showed staggering mortality rates. The connection between concentrated populations, inadequate sanitation, and mass death would have been empirically obvious even if the mechanisms remained mysterious. Archaeological evidence from Shepseskaf's tomb complex shows markedly different patterns than earlier projects. Much smaller workforce, more dispersed housing for workers, improved sanitation facilities. The Egyptians were learning, adapting based on bitter experience. The abandonment of pyramid building in favor of a large mastaba may have been partly motivated by desire to avoid repeating earlier disasters. Workers' graves from Shepseskaf's project show significantly lower mortality rates than those from Khufu's or Khafre's reigns. Fewer workers meant less crowding, better sanitation, lower transmission rates. The skeletal evidence tells a story of adaptation, but Shepseskaf's reign wasn't without its own health crises. Ritual texts from his mortuary complex include extensive purification ceremonies, particularly involving fire. One fragmentary papyrus describes cleansing through flame and purification of the workers' camps through holy fire. The Egyptians had observed that burning contaminated areas reduced disease spread. Ash analysis from workers' village sites dated to Shepseskaf's reign reveals evidence of large-scale burning. Chemical signatures indicate organic materials, textiles, wooden structures, possibly bodies. The pattern suggests not accidental fire, but deliberate destruction. The Egyptians were burning contaminated areas as a public health measure. Medical papyri from later dynasties reference purification by fire as practiced in the time of Shepseskaf. The prescriptions describe burning specific aromatics, frankincense, myrrh, cedar, believed to have cleansing properties. Modern analysis shows these substances do have antimicrobial properties. One particularly revealing text describes Shepseskaf ordering cleansing of the work camps by fire after the god sent sickness among the workers. The language frames it as divine punishment requiring religious response, but the practical effect was quarantine and disinfection by burning. Environmental analysis shows layers of ash interspersed with occupation layers. This pattern suggests periodic burning and rebuilding, not from accidental fires but from deliberate destruction and reconstruction. The Egyptians were cycling workers through camps, burning contaminated areas, and starting fresh to reduce disease transmission. Shepseskaf's decision to build a mastaba rather than a pyramid may reflect calculated risk assessment. Pyramids required massive, concentrated workforces over decades. Mastabas could be completed faster with fewer workers. If institutional memory associated pyramids with epidemic disease, choosing an alternative monument type makes sense. Later dynasties largely followed Shepseskaf's example, abandoning massive pyramid projects in favor of smaller monuments. The 5th dynasty returned to pyramids, but on much reduced scale. The connection between building scale and disease risk had apparently been recognized at institutional level. Workers' tombs from Shepseskaf's reign sometimes include inscriptions mentioning survival, who lived through the building of the king's eternal house. The emphasis on survival suggests it wasn't expected, that living through a royal building project remained an achievement worth commemorating. Sacred fires cannot completely cleanse unseen sickness, but they can reduce its spread. And sometimes, choosing not to repeat predecessors' mistakes is its own form of wisdom, even if the reasons remain half understood. Desert wind rattles temple doors, a sound like bones against wood. Crops wither in fields that should be green with the Nile's blessing. Granaries, usually full after a good inundation, sit half empty. The year is approximately 2494 BCE, and Pharaoh Userkaf founds the fifth dynasty, marking a new era in Egyptian history. But this new beginning arrives amid crisis, crops failing, food supplies dwindling, and in the wake of hunger, disease inevitable as death. Userkaf's reign represents a religious shift in Egyptian monarchy. He established the solar cult of Ra as dominant theology, building sun temples that would define Fifth Dynasty practice. But environmental and archaeological evidence suggests his reign faced more immediate concerns: agricultural collapse and the famine-related epidemics that followed. Pollen analysis from sediment cores reveals dramatic changes in cultivation patterns during Userkaf's reign. A sharp decline in cereal crops, wheat and barley, Egypt's staples. Corresponding increase in wild vegetation, suggesting fields abandoned or no longer intensively farmed. This pattern indicates not just poor harvest, but systemic agricultural failure. The Nile flood records show irregular inundations, some years too low for adequate irrigation, others too high, washing away topsoil and damaging irrigation infrastructure. Egypt's agricultural system depended on consistent flooding. Userkaf's reign didn't get that consistency. Granary records from provincial sites show depleted stocks during Userkaf's middle years. Administrative papyri mention emergency distributions and grain requisitioned from reserves. One text describes famine in the delta and petitions from hungry villages. These aren't rhetorical exaggerations. They're administrative responses to real crisis. When crops fail and food supplies shrink, disease follows inevitably. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. Desperate populations eat contaminated or inadequate food. Crowding increases as people migrate seeking food. Famine creates perfect conditions for epidemic disease. Medical papyri from later dynasties describe conditions associated with years of low Nile or times of scarce bread. The symptoms match what modern medicine recognizes as famine-related diseases: vitamin deficiencies, susceptibility to infectious disease, increased mortality from normally survivable illnesses. The Ebers Papyrus contains prescriptions specifically for treating illness born of hunger. Skeletal remains from burials dated to Userkaf's reign show markers of nutritional stress. Growth disruptions in bones indicating childhood malnutrition. Chemical analysis revealing dietary insufficiency. Higher rates of infectious disease in populations already weakened by inadequate food. The bones don't lie, people were hungry, and hunger was killing them. Priestly records contain unusual numbers of petitions to gods for agricultural relief. One text from Heliopolis includes prayers that Ra might restore the land's fertility, and that Hapi, the Nile god, might bring proper inundation. These weren't routine religious observances, but desperate pleas during crisis. The shift to solar theology during Userkaf's reign may itself be partly explained by agricultural crisis. The sun governed growing seasons. Ra's power over fertility made him the obvious divine focus when crops failed. Userkaf's emphasis on sun temples might reflect not just personal piety, but strategic theology. Archaeological evidence from market sites shows reduced trade in food goods during Userkaf's reign. Stalls that previously sold bread, beer, vegetables stood abandoned. Administrative records mention empty markets and vendors gone to the south seeking grain. The royal court itself felt the pressure. Palace expenditure records show increased outlays for food acquisition from foreign sources. Levantine grain imports, Nubian supplies, trade missions to Libya and Punt, specifically seeking food. Contemporary letters from foreign rulers mention Egyptian food requests. One text describes Egyptian traders willing to pay premium prices for grain. Egypt, usually a grain exporter, had become a desperate importer. Userkaf's response was threefold: religious appeal, the solar cult; administrative management, grain redistribution; and foreign acquisition, trade missions for food. But even pharaohs can't conjure rain or make the Nile rise. The fifth dynasty Userkaf founded would continue for over a century. But his reign set a precedent of vulnerability. a reminder that Egyptian civilization depended ultimately on the Nile's annual gift. When that gift failed, everything else collapsed, including human health in the wake of hunger. Harbor mist curls over water as cargo is unloaded silently at dawn. Wooden crates creak under the weight of exotic goods. Men glance nervously at the river, at each other, at shadows that might be moving where nothing should. The year is approximately 2487 BCE, and Pharaoh Sahure presides over Egypt's most extensive trade network yet established. Ships depart for Punt, for Byblos, for distant lands whose names the ancients barely recorded. They return bearing wonders, incense, precious woods, exotic animals, gold. They also return bearing death. Sahure's reign marked a flowering of Egyptian maritime trade. Archaeological evidence confirms expeditions to Punt, extensive trade with Byblos and the Levantine coast, and connections reaching into the Mediterranean. His mortuary temple at Al-Busir depicts these missions in detailed relief, ships loaded with goods, foreign delegations bringing tribute, wealth flowing into Egypt. But ships carry more than intended cargo. Port records from Sahure's reign contain unusual entries, references to sickness among the crew of the southern expedition, mentions of purification of harbor facilities, orders for burial of sailors who did not complete the journey. These administrative notes hint at systemic problems. Skeletal remains from burial grounds near ancient Egyptian ports dating to Sahure's era show distinctive patterns, higher mortality rates than inland populations, clustering of deaths suggesting epidemic rather than endemic disease, bone markers indicating infectious illness, particularly respiratory and hemorrhagic diseases. The ports, gateways for trade and prosperity, had become gateways for plague. Modern epidemiology explains what ancient Egyptians couldn't see. Ships from distant ports carried rats in their holds, rats carried fleas, fleas carried bubonic plague. Cargo contaminated with rodent droppings spread disease. Sailors, living in close quarters during long voyages, transmitted respiratory illnesses among themselves and then to port populations. The archaeological record shows evidence of what we'd now recognize as quarantine procedures, separate facilities for holding newly arrived cargo, areas for purification of goods before distribution, evidence of fumigation using aromatic substances. The Egyptians didn't understand microbial transmission, but they had observed that some goods, some ships, brought illness. Medical papyri from later dynasties describe diseases that arrive on ships and illness from foreign lands. One text in the Berlin Papyrus specifically mentions symptoms matching bubonic plague, swelling of lymph nodes, fever unto death, darkness of extremities. The prescription includes isolation of the afflicted and purification of their belongings by fire. Letters from foreign trading partners occasionally mention health concerns related to Egyptian ships. One text describes an Egyptian vessel arriving with sick crew and being held at anchor until the sickness passed. Egypt's trading partners had apparently learned the same lessons about disease transmission. Sahure's decision to expand maritime trade, economically brilliant, created epidemiological vulnerability. Each new route meant exposure to new pathogens. Each foreign port meant new disease exposure for Egyptian sailors who would return home. The network that brought prosperity also brought plague. Medical records show seasonal spikes in illness coinciding with trade mission returns. The pattern repeated year after year. Ships return, disease spreads, measures are taken, conditions improve, ships depart, cycle repeats. One particularly detailed papyrus fragment describes an outbreak associated specifically with the return of the Punt expedition. The symptoms match what we'd recognize as pneumonic plague or possibly anthrax. The text describes heroic efforts by physicians and priests to contain the spread, but admits that many were taken despite our efforts. Sahure's court wasn't immune. Administrative records show unusual turnover in port officials and customs inspectors. One vizier died unexpectedly, his tomb inscription mentioning he fell ill after inspection of the southern ships. The economic benefits of Sahure's trade expansion were real and substantial. Egypt's wealth increased. Exotic goods became more common. Art and architecture flourished. But the hidden cost, paid in port workers' graves and sailors' burials, never appeared in official accounting. Trade brought treasures from the ends of the earth. It also brought death from the same places. The plague ships returned laden with gold and myrrh and cedar, and invisible passengers that no customs inspection could detect. Delta canals choked with reeds. Stagnant water reflects a pale sun through morning mist. The smell of decay hangs heavy over irrigation channels that should flow clean. The year is approximately 2475 BCE, and Pharaoh Nefertiti rules an Egypt increasingly divided between the prosperous south and the troubled north. The delta, Egypt's breadbasket, is dying, and where the land dies, people follow. Nefertiti's reign is documented as relatively stable in official texts. Temple inscriptions praise his piety and building projects. His pyramid at Abusir demonstrates continued royal wealth, but provincial records from the delta tell a darker story: population decline, agricultural disruption, and cryptic references to sickness in the wetlands. Environmental studies of the Nile Delta during this period reveal troubling patterns. Sediment analysis shows increased salination, suggesting irrigation system degradation. Pollen records indicate declining cereal cultivation and expanding wild marsh vegetation. Chemical signatures show contamination consistent with inadequate water management. The delta's environment was becoming toxic. Stagnant water breeds disease. Mosquitoes transmit malaria. Contaminated water carries cholera, typhoid, dysentery. Parasitic snails, proliferating in slow-moving channels, host schistosomiasis. The delta, transformed from carefully managed wetland to neglected swamp, became an epidemiological disaster. Census records from Nefertiti's reign show significant population decline in delta districts. Not gradual demographic change, but sudden drops. 20%, 30%, in some regions over 40% population loss within a single generation. War didn't cause this. Famine alone doesn't explain it. Disease, epidemic disease, is the only explanation fitting the evidence. Administrative papyri from Delta Temple estates document the crisis in clinical detail. One text mentions villages emptied of people. Another describes fields left unworked for lack of workers. A third refers to the sickness that rises from the waters. Temple administrators watched helplessly as their workforce vanished. Medical texts from later dynasties reference delta fever and wetland sickness as distinct conditions requiring specific treatments. The Hearst Papyrus describes symptoms matching malaria: recurring fever, weakness, enlargement of the spleen. The Brooklyn Papyrus includes prescriptions for water sickness, treatments for cholera and dysentery. Skeletal remains from delta burial sites, dated to Nefertiti's era, show markers of endemic parasitic disease. Bone chemistry reveals chronic malaria infection. Evidence of schistosomiasis appears with unusual frequency. Growth disruptions indicate childhood illness, followed by stunted development in survivors. The physical anthropology confirms what texts suggest. Delta populations were systemically unhealthy. One particularly detailed papyrus fragment, possibly a letter from a Delta temple priest to the royal court, describes conditions vividly. The waters carry death. Those who drink sicken. Those who wade in the channels develop sores that fester. The air itself seems poisoned. We make offerings daily, but the gods do not hear. Nefertiti's response was inadequate. There's no evidence of major water management projects or environmental remediation attempts. The royal focus remained on Upper Egypt and the Memphis region. The delta, distant from the royal court, suffered neglect even as its crisis deepened. This neglect had consequences beyond the immediate health crisis. The delta's agricultural productivity declined, reducing Egypt's overall grain supply. Labor shortages affected temple economies. Political stability weakened as local populations struggled with disease and deprivation. Foreign correspondence from this period mentions difficulties trading with northern Egypt. One merchant's letter describes arriving at delta ports to find many towns nearly abandoned and few healthy workers to unload cargo. The long-term impact outlasted Nefertiti's reign. Population decline in the delta continued into subsequent reigns. Agricultural productivity remained suppressed. The region that had been Egypt's most productive district became its most troubled. Later tradition didn't preserve memory of this crisis, but in the sediment layers, in the population data, in the skeletal remains and medical texts, evidence remained for archaeologists to eventually uncover. Families vanish overnight from villages that had stood for centuries. Priests offer prayers over empty homes, while reeds reclaim former farmland. Children orphaned by disease wander through dying towns. And over it all, the delta sun rises and sets on waters that should give life but now carry only death. Night in Memphis. Torchlight flickers along deserted corridors where laughter should echo. The palace feels empty despite the servants moving like shadows through darkened rooms. The year is approximately 2460 BCE, and Pharaoh Neferefre, young heir to the 5th dynasty throne, rules briefly before vanishing from history. His pyramid at Abu Sir remains incomplete, barely begun. His reign lasted perhaps 2 years, possibly less. Official records are deliberately vague about his death, but palace documents hint at something that moved through the royal household like invisible fire. Neferefre ascended young, possibly still a teenager. Archaeological evidence suggests he began his reign with appropriate ceremony, building projects initiated, administrative appointments made, religious rituals performed. Everything seemed normal, and then, suddenly, it ended. The official account is frustratingly sparse. King lists acknowledge his reign, but give no details. His mortuary temple was hastily completed by his successor using mud brick rather than stone, suggesting unexpected death and rushed funeral preparations. His pyramid barely rose above foundation level before work ceased. This wasn't normal royal death. This was crisis. Tomb inscriptions from palace officials who served Neferefre contain unusual language. One text mentions the shadow that fell upon the royal house. Another refers to sudden darkness in the palace. A third describes many taken in a short time, the young king among them. The phrasing suggests not isolated death, but cluster mortality, multiple people dying within days or weeks. Skeletal analysis from burials associated with Neferefre's court reveals patterns consistent with acute infectious disease. Young adults dying suddenly, no trauma, no signs of chronic illness, just rapid onset, fever, death. The bone chemistry suggests something like typhoid fever or possibly meningitis, diseases that kill quickly, spread easily in close quarters, and show no mercy to age or status. Palace architectural evidence supports the epidemic hypothesis. One section of the royal residence at Memphis shows signs of having been sealed and abandoned during Neferefre's reign. Rooms left with belongings in place, doors sealed with mud brick, inscriptions on the ceiling referring to purification pending. The Egyptians had quarantined part of their own palace. Medical peheri from later periods reference the palace fever, or illness that strikes the royal house. One text in the Ebers Papyrus describes symptoms matching typhoid, high fever, abdominal pain, characteristic rash, delirium, death within weeks. The prescription includes isolation of the sick and burning of their belongings, ancient quarantine and disinfection protocols. Contemporary administrative records show unusual patterns in palace staffing, multiple positions changing hands rapidly, references to replacements needed and offices left empty. One fragmentary papyrus mentions nursemaids dying despite care and the young king's illness progressing. Neferefre's mummy showed signs of having died young, possibly late teens or early 20s. Modern medical examination found no evidence of trauma or obvious chronic disease. He simply died young, suddenly, during a reign too brief to be explained by natural causes. The succession itself reveals crisis. Neferefre's brother Shepseskare took power, ruling perhaps only months before another brother, Nusera, became pharaoh. This rapid succession through multiple brothers suggests none had clear legitimacy, or perhaps all were scrambling to survive the same epidemic that killed Neferefre. Foreign correspondence from this period mentions instability in Egypt and uncertainty about the king. One Byblos merchant's letter describes hearing the young pharaoh has died, and another rules, or perhaps two have ruled since last correspondence. Later tradition barely remembered Neferefre. He became a footnote, a brief reign between more substantial kings. But this forgetting may have been intentional. Egyptian scribes, when faced with catastrophes that challenged royal ideology, often chose selective amnesia. Nursemaids whisper as they change gowns damp with feverish sweat. Attendants carry bodies silently through back corridors. Physicians try remedy after remedy while the young king weakens. And then, suddenly, it's over. The reign ends. The palace seals contaminated rooms. And everyone pretends this was normal, ordained by the gods rather than caused by invisible bacteria. Even heirs, prepared from birth to rule, are not spared from the shadows. The sun blazes down on pristine temple walls dedicated to Ra, the solar deity whose cult dominates 5th dynasty theology. Offerings remain untouched on altar stones, slowly decaying in the merciless heat. The year is approximately 2445 BCE, and Pharaoh Nusere-Ini presides over Egypt's most elaborate solar cult yet developed. Temples to Ra multiply across Egypt. Priesthoods expand, religious devotion reaches fever pitch. But even sacred dedication cannot shield flesh from disease, and even sun temples cannot illuminate what kills in darkness. Nusere's reign lasted roughly 3 decades. Official records present a picture of religious fervor and architectural achievement. He completed his predecessor's unfinished monuments, built extensively himself, and elevated the solar cult to unprecedented prominence. This was, by all official accounts, a golden age of piety and prosperity. But the worker cemeteries tell a different story. Excavations at solar temple construction sites have revealed mortality patterns that challenge the Golden Age narrative. Skeletal remains show repeated waves of infectious disease. Not continuous endemic illness, but periodic epidemic spikes, sudden increases in death rates, then declines, then new spikes. The pattern suggests recurring outbreaks, possibly seasonal, definitely deadly. Medical papyri from later dynasties reference the temple sickness, and specifically associate it with solar temple construction. The Hearst papyrus describes symptoms including fever, respiratory distress, and skin lesions, possibly anthrax or another zoonotic disease. The connection to temple construction suggests exposure to contaminated materials or livestock used in sacrificial rituals. Solar temples required massive livestock sacrifices. Bulls, birds, other animals brought in huge numbers, slaughtered, butchered, and offered to Ra. The blood, the carcasses, the waste, all created perfect conditions for disease transmission. Anthrax, brucellosis, and other zoonotic pathogens thrive in such environments. The very acts meant to honor the gods may have been spreading death. Administrative records from Nusere's reign show unusual expenditures on purification of sacred spaces and cleansing after offerings. One text describes sickness among the priests who handle the sacrifices. Another mentions death of workers in the butchering yards. The connection between ritual slaughter and human illness had apparently been observed. Skeletal analysis from priest burials dated to Nusere's reign reveals occupational disease patterns. Bone lesions consistent with chronic infection. Chemical signatures suggesting exposure to anthrax or similar pathogens. These weren't aging priests dying of old age. These were men in their prime, dying from occupational hazards inherent in their sacred duties. The worker villages associated with Nusere's building projects show evidence of periodic health crises, mass graves from epidemic events, sections of villages abandoned then reoccupied, evidence of large-scale fumigation and ritual purification. One particularly detailed papyrus fragment describes an outbreak at a solar temple. The text mentions workers falling ill after the great sacrifice and fever spreading through the temple compound. It describes desperate purification attempts, prayers to Ra for healing, and ultimately mass death despite all efforts. Environmental analysis of temple sites reveals biological hazards. Soil samples show contamination with pathogens associated with livestock and decay. Water sources near temples show contamination from sacrificial waste. The sacred spaces, meant to be purest places in Egypt, had become epidemiologically dangerous. The irony is profound. Egyptians built these temples to honor Ra, the god who brought life and health. They performed elaborate rituals meant to maintain cosmic order. They sacrificed countless animals to ensure divine favor. and in doing so, they created conditions for disease transmission that killed the very people meant to be under divine protection. Later dynasties continued solar cult practices, but with modifications. Sixth Dynasty temples show improved waste management, better water separation from sacrificial areas, and evidence of more systematic purification protocols. The Egyptians learned from bitter experience, adapting practices to reduce disease transmission even if they didn't understand the underlying mechanisms. Even sacred devotion cannot shield the flesh from invisible enemies. Even the sun god's favor cannot sterilize contaminated meat or purify polluted water. The temples rise, magnificent and eternal, but the workers and priests who serve them die with distressing regularity, proving that even in sacred service, mortality is inescapable. The banquet hall gleams with gold and alabaster. Musicians' melodies drift through incense smoke. Nobles laugh, servants pour, platters overflow with delicacies from across Egypt. The year is approximately 2421 BCE, and Pharaoh Menkaure celebrates a successful harvest, perhaps, or a diplomatic achievement, or simply another royal feast among many. But before the night ends, guests will fall silent. Within days, many will be dead, and the physicians will have no explanation beyond the god's will. Menkaure's reign is poorly documented compared to earlier Fifth Dynasty kings. His pyramid has never been definitively located. King lists acknowledge him, but provide minimal detail. This obscurity might reflect brief rule or deliberate historical minimization. What evidence survives suggests his reign was marked by crisis, specifically epidemic disease striking the highest levels of society. The most revealing evidence comes from tomb inscriptions of nobles who died during Menkaure's reign. Unlike typical Egyptian autobiography celebrating life achievements, these texts emphasize sudden death. One high official's tomb inscription mentions being called unexpectedly to the west and taken despite health and youth. Another describes dying in the year of sickness. A third simply notes the fever took him. The clustering is statistically significant. Analysis of death dates among high officials shows unusual concentration, multiple nobles dying within short periods. This isn't normal baseline mortality. This suggests epidemic events striking the elite simultaneously. Medical papyri from later dynasties reference feast sickness and describe symptoms consistent with foodborne illness, severe gastrointestinal distress, fever, rapid progression to death in severe cases. The Ebers Papyrus includes prescriptions for treating illness that follows great banquets and notes this was common in earlier times. The connection between feasting and foodborne illness would have been empirically obvious even to ancient observers. When multiple people who ate together fall ill together, the pattern is clear even without understanding bacterial contamination. The Egyptians developed protocols, food tasting, specific preparation methods, prayers before eating. But these measures couldn't prevent outbreaks completely. Archaeological evidence from palace compounds dated to Menkaure's era shows unusual features in food preparation areas, extra elaborate washing facilities, evidence of food testing protocols, multiple separated kitchens, possibly to prevent single-source contamination. The Egyptians were adapting food preparation practices in response to repeated poisoning events. Skeletal remains from nobles' burials of this period sometimes show markers of acute gastrointestinal illness, dehydration signatures in bone chemistry, evidence of rapid wasting. These weren't slow deaths from chronic disease. These were acute crises, bodies failing rapidly. From toxins or pathogens, climate may have played a role. Egypt's heat creates perfect conditions for bacterial growth in food. Royal banquets featured elaborate dishes prepared hours before serving, meat, fish, dairy products, all prone to rapid spoilage and heat. The very luxury that defined royal feasting created conditions for deadly contamination. One fragmentary administrative text from this period describes aftermath of a feast. Many nobles taken ill, physicians summoned, prayers offered, some recovered, many did not. The king's grief was great. The clinical description suggests medical crisis management, not political intrigue. This was outbreak response, not coup aftermath. Later traditions occasionally reference dangerous feasts, Literary texts warned about accepting food at royal banquets. Wisdom literature advised caution around elaborate meals. While some of this reflected poison paranoia, the underlying concern about feast-associated death was rooted in real experience. The impact extended beyond immediate mortality. Losing multiple high officials simultaneously disrupted administration. Feast-associated deaths created succession problems, political instability, and fear among survivors. If courtiers couldn't safely eat at royal banquets, how could the court function? Menkaur's shortened reign, an obscure pyramid, might partly reflect this crisis. If his court was devastated by feast-associated epidemic, completing ambitious monuments would have been impossible. Modern foodborne illness kills even with antibiotics. In ancient Egypt, without understanding of bacterial contamination or effective treatments, a serious outbreak could devastate even privileged populations. Even celebration carries a shadow of death. Even the finest foods can harbor invisible killers that show no respect for rank or power. Dusty corridors of Memphis, the scent of papyrus and decay thicken the air where it should smell of cedar and incense. The year is approximately 2414 BCE, and Pharaoh Djedkare-Isisi presides over what administrative records call a successful reign. Nearly 40 years of stable rule. Building projects completed, administration functioning. But within the palace walls, within the servants' quarters, within the very water jars that line every corridor, death lurks in forms no one yet understands. Djedkare's long reign appears successful in official records. He reformed administration, expanded trade, built extensively. His pyramid at South Saqqara demonstrates continued royal wealth. But the evidence hidden in skeletal remains and fragmentary medical texts reveals a darker pattern. Chronic endemic illness among palace servants and lower-ranking nobles, caused by contaminated water and inadequate sanitation. The palace at Memphis during Djedkare's reign was extensive, a sprawling complex housing thousands. Servants, officials, craftsmen, soldiers, administrators, priests, all living in close proximity, all sharing water sources, all producing waste that had to go somewhere. The infrastructure, designed centuries earlier for smaller populations, was overwhelmed. Skeletal analysis from servant burials near Memphis, dated to Djedkare's reign, reveals patterns of chronic gastrointestinal disease, bone markers indicating persistent parasitic infection, chemical signatures suggesting repeated bouts of waterborne illness, growth disruptions in young adults indicating illness throughout their developing years. These people lived their entire lives with chronic intestinal disease. The types of illness indicated match what modern epidemiology associates with contaminated water. Chronic dysentery, persistent parasitic infections, repeated cholera exposure. Living in these conditions, palace servants would have experienced frequent diarrhea, malnutrition despite adequate food availability, compromised immune systems, shortened lifespans. Medical papyri from later periods describe palace complaints and servant sickness, conditions characterized by persistent digestive problems. The Ebers Papyrus includes extensive prescriptions for treating intestinal disease, many labeled as used for palace workers or common among those who serve in great houses. Archaeological evidence from palace sites reveals the infrastructure failure, water sources contaminated by proximity to waste disposal areas, evidence of sewage systems inadequate for population density. Analysis of ancient well water shows chemical signatures of persistent contamination. The very water meant to sustain life was slowly poisoning those who drank it. Administrative records from Djedkare's reign occasionally reference health issues. One papyrus fragment mentions sickness among the servants requiring replacement workers. Another describes purification of palace wells after contamination. These administrative details are invaluable to epidemiologists. One particularly revealing papyrus fragment describes water treatment protocols, instructions for palace servants on preparing drinking water. The text recommends filtering through cloth, adding natron, allowing sediment to settle, and drinking only from upper portions of vessels. These protocols, empirically developed, actually would have reduced bacterial contamination, even though Egyptians didn't understand bacteria. Foreign visitors occasionally commented on Egyptian health practices, One Akkadian diplomat's letter mentions the Egyptians' obsession with purification and notes that even their servants wash constantly and treat their drinking water. What foreigners saw as religious peculiarity was actually public health practice born from bitter experience. Djedkre's reign lasted 4 decades. That means 4 decades of servants drinking contaminated water, living with chronic disease, dying prematurely from conditions that better infrastructure could have prevented. 4 decades of needless suffering maintained because fixing fundamental infrastructure problems wasn't politically or economically prioritized. Later dynasties eventually addressed these issues. New kingdom palaces show evidence of improved water management and sewage systems. But during Djedkare's reign, the problem persisted, a dark secret hidden behind palace walls. Children with swollen bellies from parasitic infection play in corridors. Physicians dispense remedies that treat symptoms, but can't address the contaminated water causing them. The palace stands, magnificent and imposing. But within its walls, invisible death flows through water pipes and settles in drinking jars, killing slowly but efficiently. Pyramid chambers echo with flickering torchlight. Hieroglyphs dance on stone walls. The pyramid texts, humanity's oldest religious literature, promising eternal life. The year is approximately 2375 BCE, and Pharaoh Unas completes the last pyramid of the 5th dynasty. His monument isn't Egypt's largest, but it's the first to be inscribed with the spells and prayers that will guide him through the afterlife. These texts promise protection from every danger, but they cannot protect the living from the invisible dangers that haunt construction sites. Unas's pyramid at Saqqara represents both achievement and transition. The pyramid texts revolutionize royal burial practices. These spells, previously oral traditions, are now literally carved into stone, permanent, eternal, unchanging. But while Unas secured his eternal protection, his workers died with disturbing frequency from threats no spell could address. The workers' cemetery associated with Unas's pyramid reveals mortality patterns consistent with epidemic disease. Skeletal remains show markers of infectious illness. Clustering of burial dates suggests epidemic events rather than steady background mortality. Chemical analysis indicates these workers suffered from acute illnesses that killed quickly. What makes Unas's case particularly interesting is evidence of ritual-related illness. The pyramid complex included extensive religious facilities requiring numerous priests and ritual specialists. These individuals handled offerings, performed ceremonies, burned incense, and participated in elaborate funerary practices. And some of these practices were making them sick. Medical papyri from later periods reference ritual fever and temple sickness, conditions associated with religious service. The descriptions include respiratory symptoms, skin reactions, and systemic illness. Modern medical understanding suggests several possibilities: respiratory damage from heavy incense exposure, infections from handling contaminated offerings, or even anthrax from animal sacrifices. Archaeological evidence from Unas's pyramid complex shows unusual concentrations of medical supplies in priests' quarters: honey, herbal compounds, mineral treatments, all present in quantities suggesting active medical intervention. The priests serving the pyramid needed frequent medical care. One fragmentary inscription from Unas's mortuary temple refers to purification of priests who have become unclean. In Egyptian religious context, unclean could mean ritually impure or physically contaminated. Given the medical evidence, this probably referred to priests who had become ill through their temple service. Skeletal analysis from priest burials near Unas's complex shows occupational disease patterns. Respiratory damage consistent with heavy smoke exposure. Bone markers suggesting chronic infection. Evidence of skin conditions, possibly from handling contaminated materials. These weren't healthy men living long lives. These were workers whose service literally killed them. The ritual activities themselves created health hazards. Burning massive quantities of incense in enclosed spaces causes respiratory damage. Handling rotting offerings spreads bacterial contamination. Slaughtering sacrificial animals exposes workers to zoonotic diseases. The very acts meant to ensure Unas's eternal life endangered those performing them. Contemporary administrative records mention replacement priests needed with unusual frequency. One papyrus fragment refers to illness among the temple workers and need for new personnel. The turnover rate suggests that ritual service in Unis's complex was recognized as dangerous work. Later tradition remembered Unas primarily for the pyramid texts, the innovation that would influence Egyptian religion for millennia. But the human cost of maintaining his cult was quietly forgotten. The priests who coughed from smoke inhalation, the workers who died from infections, the ritual specialists who sacrificed their health for his eternal glory, none of them appear in official memory. Environmental analysis of temple chambers shows biological contamination. Soil samples reveal bacteria associated with decay and disease. Air quality in sealed chambers would have been dangerously poor. The priests working in these conditions breathed contaminated air, handled contaminated materials, and paid with their health. The irony is profound. Unas's pyramid texts promise eternal protection from every danger. They describe elaborate defenses against threats both physical and metaphysical. But they offer nothing for the priests who maintain his cult, the workers who serve his memory, the living who pay the price of his eternity. Palace halls heavy with incense and the metallic tang of fever. Physicians move from room to room, exhaustion written in every step. The year is approximately 2345 BCE, and Pharaoh Teti has founded the 6th dynasty after the 5th dynasty ended in confusion and instability. His reign begins with promise, administrative reforms, building projects, diplomatic initiatives. But within his court, within the very heart of power, epidemic disease strikes with devastating precision. Teti's assassination is recorded in tradition. Manetho mentions he was murdered by his bodyguards. But before that violent end, his court endured something equally deadly: repeated waves of epidemic illness that killed nobles, officials, and priests with disturbing frequency. The skeletal evidence, the tomb inscriptions, the medical texts all point to a court under siege from invisible enemies. Tomb inscriptions for nobles who died during Teti's reign contain unusual language. One high official's tomb mentions the fever that swept through the great house. Another describes sudden death among the king's companions. A third refers to the year when many nobles fell. The clustering, the language of surprise, the emphasis on multiple deaths, all suggest epidemic rather than isolated mortality. Skeletal remains from nobles' tombs of this era show markers of acute infectious disease, rapid death in otherwise healthy adults, bone chemistry indicating systemic infection. No trauma, no signs of chronic illness, just sudden catastrophic illness followed by death. Medical papieri from later dynasties reference court fever of Teti's time. The Berlin Papyrus describes symptoms consistent with typhus or similar epidemic disease: sudden high fever, rash, delirium, high mortality. The text notes this was common among those who lived in close quarters and particularly deadly among the great ones of the palace. The epidemiological explanation is straightforward. Palace compounds housed hundreds or thousands of people in close proximity: nobles, servants, guards, administrators, all sharing enclosed spaces, touching the same surfaces, breathing the same air. Perfect conditions for respiratory disease transmission. Once an epidemic started, it could rip through the palace before anyone understood what was happening. Archaeological evidence from Teti's palace complex shows evidence of crisis response, one section sealed and abandoned during his reign, evidence of fumigation in administrative quarters, medical supplies concentrated in specific areas, probably makeshift treatment facilities. Administrative records from Teti's reign show unusual turnover in high positions: viziers, treasurers, high priests, positions changing hands multiple times in short periods, not from political purges, but from what texts delicately call natural causes. The administrative class was being decimated by disease. Contemporary diplomatic correspondence mentions instability in Egypt. One Levantine prince's letter expresses concern about the sickness in Egypt's court and asks if trade delegations will be safe. Egyptian epidemic disease was visible even to foreign observers. One particularly revealing papyrus fragment describes an outbreak. The fever came suddenly among the courtiers. First 1, then 5, then 20 fell ill. Physicians could not stem the tide. Prayers were offered, purifications performed, but still the fever took them. The queen's own attendants died. Even the king's advisors were struck down. The impact on court function would have been catastrophic. Key administrators dying mid-project. Institutional knowledge lost. Administrative chaos as survivors scrambled to fill positions they weren't trained for. The very machinery of government was breaking down from personnel losses. Teti's ultimate assassination might even be connected to this crisis. If epidemic disease had decimated his court and destroyed confidence in his ability to maintain Ma'at, his bodyguards might have seen his removal as necessary to save Egypt. The court epidemic of Teti's reign represents a specific vulnerability of centralized power. Concentrating authority in one location creates a single point of failure. When epidemic disease strikes that concentration, the entire governmental apparatus can collapse. Authority cannot shield the powerful from sickness. Position offers no immunity. When epidemic disease enters a palace, it shows no respect for rank or title, killing noble and servant with equal efficiency. Canals thick with algae, water moving sluggishly if at all, the air heavy with decay, the smell of stagnant water and dying vegetation. The year is approximately 2321 BCE, and Pharaoh Pipi rules an Egypt facing environmental collapse in its most productive region. The Nile Delta, breadbasket of the nation, source of wealth and grain, is dying. And where the land dies, the people follow. Not immediately, not dramatically, but slowly, inexorably, ground down by disease born from ecological catastrophe. Pipi the Horn's reign lasted perhaps 50 years, one of the longest in Egyptian history. Official records presented as successful, building projects completed, administration functioning, foreign trade maintained. But environmental data tells a different story. The delta, stressed by centuries of intensive agriculture and inadequate water management, was reaching a tipping point. Environmental analysis of Nile Delta sediments from Pepi's reign reveals disturbing patterns. Increased salination, indicating irrigation system breakdown. Evidence of eutrophication, nutrient pollution causing algae blooms and oxygen depletion. Chemical signatures of heavy contamination from human and animal waste. The delta's aquatic ecosystem was collapsing under pollution load. When water systems fail, disease follows inevitably. Stagnant water breeds mosquitoes carrying malaria. Contaminated water spreads cholera and dysentery. Parasitic infections flourish in degraded waterways. The delta's population, dependent on these compromised water sources, faced endemic disease on a massive scale. Census data from Pepi's reign shows population decline in delta regions. Not dramatic collapses, but steady erosion, 5% here, 10% there. Regions losing population year after year. Agricultural productivity declined correspondingly. Villages abandoned not from conquest, but from slow demographic bleeding. Medical papyri reference delta fever and marsh sickness as distinct conditions requiring specific treatments. The Hearst papyrus describes symptoms matching malaria, recurring fever, weakness, enlarged spleen. The Brooklyn papyrus treats waterborne diseases with prescriptions for contaminated water exposure. Skeletal remains from delta burial sites of this era show markers of chronic parasitic disease at extraordinarily high rates. Schistosomiasis appears in over 40% of analyzed remains. Malaria markers appear with similar frequency. The physical anthropology confirms what environmental data suggests. Delta populations were systemically unhealthy. Administrative records show increasing royal attention to delta problems. Texts mention emergency grain requisitions from delta regions, references to tax relief for affected districts, orders for purification of canals in the northern lands. The government was attempting intervention, but the problems ran deeper than administrative solutions could address. Agricultural productivity data shows delta yields declining during Pepi's reign, not from drought. The Nile still flooded. Not from invasion, from ecological degradation making farming increasingly difficult as salt poisoned soil and disease weakened farmers. The environmental collapse wasn't sudden or dramatic. It was slow, grinding, easy to ignore year by year, but devastating over decades. Each generation inherited slightly worse conditions. Children grew up weaker than their parents. Villages slowly emptied. Fields gradually went uncultivated. Foreign trade records show Egypt increasingly importing grain during Pipi's later years. Egypt, historically a grain exporter, was becoming dependent on foreign food supplies to supplement domestic shortfalls. The delta's production decline was affecting national food security. One particularly detailed inscription from Pepi's later reign describes conditions. The northern lands are troubled. The waters do not run clean. The crops struggle. The people suffer illness. We make offerings daily, but the gods seem distant. The long-term consequences extended beyond Pepi's reign. The delta's degradation contributed to the first intermediate period's instability. You can't build a kingdom on a dying agricultural base. Environmental catastrophe undermines political stability. Children with swollen bellies from parasites, too weak to work. Farmers struggling in fields where crops grow poorly in salt-poisoned soil. Families abandoning villages their ancestors inhabited for centuries. And through it all, the canals flowing sluggishly with contaminated water that brings disease instead of life. Desert sun beats down on abandoned markets. Wind stirs dust over empty streets where commerce once flourished. The year is approximately 2283 BCE, and Pharaoh Merenre rules a reign that will be remembered primarily for its brevity, perhaps 9 years, possibly less. Official records are sparse, administrative documents thin. The archaeological record itself seems depleted, as if Egypt held its breath and left little trace. And when we examine what evidence survives, a pattern emerges. Population dropping sharply, plague suspected, silence maintained. Merenre's short reign followed his father, Pepi the Firm's long rule. Succession appeared normal, no recorded political crisis, no military disaster, no obvious reason for state collapse. Yet something was deeply wrong. The census data shows population decline accelerating, tax receipts dropping, administrative correspondence mentioning empty villages and lands without farmers. Skeletal remains from burials dated to Merenre's reign show markers of acute infectious disease. Not chronic conditions, but sudden catastrophic illness. Bone chemistry and pathology, consistent with plague or similar epidemic disease. The pattern suggests not endemic illness, but epidemic outbreak, sudden, severe, deadly. Tomb inscriptions for officials who died during Merenre's reign contain unusual brevity. Where Egyptian autobiography typically celebrates life achievements, these texts are stark: name, title, death. As if scribes had neither time nor heart for elaborate commemoration, or as if so many were dying that individual attention became impossible. The lack of building projects during Merenre's reign is notable. Merenre's pyramid at Saqqara was planned but poorly executed, completed hastily and shoddily by his successor. This suggests administrative capacity collapse, inability to marshal resources for major projects. Medical papyri from later dynasties occasionally reference the silent years or Merenre's time. The descriptions are cryptic, but suggest widespread illness. One text mentions the plague that spread unseen and death that came suddenly to all ranks. Another describes symptoms matching pneumonic plague, sudden fever, respiratory distress, death within days. The silence itself is evidence. Egyptian administration produced mountains of papyri. Merenre's reign shows dramatic decline in papyrus production, not because less happened, but because fewer people were alive to record it. Administrative breakdown from population loss created documentary silence. Contemporary references from foreign sources provide outside perspective. One Sumerian merchant's account mentions great sickness in Kemet and notes that trade has become difficult as Egyptians cannot fulfill obligations. The observation suggests epidemic disease visible even to distant observers. The speed of population decline suggests something more virulent than endemic disease. Plague, probably bubonic or pneumonic, could produce the observed pattern. Initial cases spreading rapidly through trade routes. Secondary pneumonic transmission person to person. High mortality rates overwhelming social structures. Archaeological evidence from settlements shows abandonment patterns consistent with epidemic. Not gradual decline, but sudden cessation. Houses left with possessions in place. Workshops abandoned mid-project. the signature of population fleeing or dying faster than survivors, could organize orderly evacuation. Religious responses appear in texts, increased offerings to Sekhmet, goddess of plague and healing, prayers for protection from invisible arrows, rituals meant to purify communities and turn away divine wrath. Merenre's own death, occurring young after brief reign, might itself be plague-related. Later tradition suggests unusual circumstances, but provides no detail. If the king died from the same epidemic killing his subjects, scribes might have obscured this as undermining pharaonic divinity. The succession is revealing. Merenre's brother, Pepi II, took power, ruling for what tradition claims was 90 years. This extraordinarily long reign might reflect Pepi II ascending very young after epidemic had killed other candidates. Later, memory largely forgot Merenre. Sandwiched between his father's long reign and his brother's even longer one, Merenre became a brief footnote. The silence that characterized his reign extended to his historical memory. Even brief reigns leave indelible marks when those reigns coincide with plague. Even pharaohs whose names are barely remembered changed history through the catastrophes they witnessed but couldn't prevent. The throne room suffused with the smell of incense and illness. Old age hangs heavy in the air. The pharaoh has ruled so long that few remember a time before his reign. The year is approximately 2246 BCE, late in the longest reign in Egyptian history. Tradition claims Pharaoh Pepi II ruled for 94 years, though scholars debate the exact length. What's undeniable is that his extraordinarily extended rule coincided with Egypt's slow collapse into the First Intermediate Period, and that chronic epidemic disease played a significant role in that unraveling. Pepi II ascended young, possibly as a child. He ruled through Egypt's decline from centralized power into regional fragmentation. Official records from his early reign show typical administrative function, but documents from his later years reveal a kingdom falling apart. Provincial governors claiming independence, royal authority eroding, administrative capacity collapsing. And beneath this political dissolution runs a darker current, chronic epidemic disease that weakened Egypt generation by generation. The length of Pepi II's reign meant he witnessed multiple epidemic waves. Population data, reconstructed from tax records and archaeological surveys, shows repeated cycles of decline. Every decade or so, another epidemic swept through, each one leaving Egypt weaker than before. The cumulative effect was devastating. Not dramatic collapse, but grinding demographic erosion. Medical papyri compiled during or shortly after Pepi's reign contain extensive disease descriptions. The Ebers Papyrus, though compiled later, draws on much older sources including texts from this period. The medical knowledge reflects hard experience, treatments for plague, cholera, typhoid, malaria, all the epidemic diseases that apparently plagued Pepi's Egypt repeatedly. Skeletal remains from burial sites across Egypt show interesting temporal patterns. Early in Pepi's reign, skeletons show typical baseline health markers. Mid-reign, disease markers increase. Late reign, the skeletal evidence reveals populations under severe health stress, chronic illness, malnutrition, high mortality rates. The physical anthropology documents Egypt's decline written in bone. Administrative correspondence from Pepi's later years reveals crisis. Letters from provincial governors reporting villages empty of inhabitants. Reports of fields uncultivated for lack of workers. Descriptions of sickness that returns each season. The papyri document slow-motion catastrophe as disease repeatedly struck already weakened populations. One particularly detailed text describes an outbreak. The fever returned again this year. It took the young and old alike. Physicians attended but could not save most. The granaries stand half empty because there are not enough healthy workers to bring in the harvest. We pray for divine intervention, but the sickness continues. The political fragmentation that characterizes the First Intermediate Period cannot be understood without considering the health crisis. Regional governors declared independence partly because royal authority had weakened, but royal authority weakened partly because plague kept killing key personnel. Disease and political collapse reinforced each other in downward spiral. Priests' petitions to gods intensified during Pepi's later reign. Archaeological evidence shows massive increases in religious offerings. temple construction, and ritual activity. This wasn't just piety, it was desperation. When practical measures fail against epidemic disease, societies turn to supernatural explanations. Egypt's religious intensification reflected medical crisis. One revealing aspect is the change in burial practices. Early in Pepi's reign, burials follow traditional elaborate patterns. Late reign, even nobles receive simplified burials. When epidemic disease produces too many dead too quickly, traditional practices break down. Pepi himself supposedly lived into his 90s. But longevity for one man, while his kingdom died around him, is its own tragedy. He witnessed Egypt's decline from magnificent unified kingdom to fractured regional states. He saw epidemic disease repeatedly devastate populations. Later tradition remembered Pepi II's reign as a turning point, the end of the Old Kingdom's glory. But historical analysis reveals the chaos wasn't sudden political collapse, but slow demographic erosion caused largely by chronic epidemic disease. Longevity in power brought longevity in suffering. The longest reign witnessed the longest decline. And through it all, invisible epidemic disease ground away at Egypt's foundations until the magnificent structure of the Old Kingdom finally collapsed. Harbor fog rolls in thick and cold. Cargo is unloaded with cautious hands, sailors glancing nervously at crates and each other. Quarantine flags hang limp in dead air. The year is uncertain, perhaps 2020 BCE, perhaps later. And Pharaoh Userkare rules Egypt briefly during the chaos of the First Intermediate Period. Little is known about his reign. Some king lists don't mention him at all. But what fragmentary evidence survives suggests his brief rule coincided with epidemic disease traced to maritime trade, the plague ships returning once again. Userkare is one of ancient Egypt's mystery kings. His reign lasted perhaps 2 years during the confused transition from 6th to 7th, 8th dynasties. Archaeological evidence is minimal. Textual references are sparse. He appears in some king lists, but not others, suggesting later scribes were uncertain about his legitimacy, or simply couldn't recover reliable information about such a brief, troubled reign. But worker letters and port records that survive from approximately this period reveal a health crisis centered on trade routes and harbor facilities. These texts mention plague spreading through ports, ships arriving with sick crews, quarantine measures that failed to contain outbreaks. The pattern matches historical plague epidemics' maritime spread. Shipping logs, fragmentary and damaged, describe crews falling ill during voyages. One text mentions sailors dying before reaching port. Another refers to cargo abandoned because the ship's crew was lost to fever. A third describes vessels arriving with half their men dead. The trade routes that connected Egypt to the wider world had become disease vectors. Port facilities from this period show evidence of desperate quarantine attempts, separate holding areas for newly arrived ships, signs of cargo fumigation, evidence of burning in harbor districts, probably destroying contaminated goods or fumigating warehouses. The Egyptians understood empirically that ships and cargo could carry disease, and they tried to limit spread through quarantine and destruction. Skeletal analysis from port worker burials of this era shows markers consistent with bubonic plague. Bone lesions, chemical signatures, pathology patterns all suggest plague exposure. Modern epidemiology confirms that plague spreads efficiently through trade routes, traveling in rat populations aboard ships. Ancient Egypt's trade network was also its disease network. Medical texts from this chaotic period are rare, but those that survive include plague treatments. The Hearst Papyrus contains prescriptions for swelling sickness accompanied by fever, possibly bubonic plague's characteristic symptom. The treatments wouldn't have worked, but their presence confirms the disease was known and feared. Administrative responses appear in fragmentary texts, orders to close ports, instructions to quarantine arriving vessels, commands to burn suspect cargo. The government, weak and fragmented. During the First Intermediate Period, still attempted public health measures even if enforcement was inconsistent. Religious texts from harbor temples show increased emphasis on protective deities. Prayers to Bez and Hathor, gods associated with protection during dangerous journeys. The theological response reflects awareness that trade carried risks requiring divine protection. The economic impact was severe. Trade revenue declined. Imported goods became scarce. Egypt's economy, already stressed by political fragmentation, suffered additional shock from trade disruption caused by plague fears. Ports, normally sources of wealth, became feared as sources of death. Userkare's brief, obscure reign might itself reflect plague's impact. If epidemic disease killed political leaders, succession could become chaotic. Multiple claimants, brief reigns, uncertainty about legitimacy, all symptoms of political system under stress from high mortality among potential rulers. Later tradition barely remembered Userkare. The few references that survive suggest uncertainty about his reign's legitimacy and length. This obscurity might reflect genuine confusion from a chaotic period, or deliberate erasure of an embarrassing episode. The pattern revealed by Userkare's fragmentary evidence is familiar. Trade expansion creates disease vulnerability. Maritime commerce brings economic benefits and biological risks. Egypt's international connections, source of wealth and power, were also infection routes for epidemic disease. Sailors whisper warnings. Avoid that ship. That cargo carries death. Port officials argue about quarantine durations. Harbor workers refuse to unload certain vessels. And somewhere, briefly Userkare rules Egypt. His reign swallowed by the chaos plague creates. Military tents line the Nile's banks. River laps at boots gone soggy from long campaign. The smell of army camp, sweat, smoke, leather, thousands of men living rough, mixes with something else, something subtle and wrong. The year is approximately 2040 BCE, and Pharaoh Mentuhotep II is reunifying Egypt after a century of fragmentation. His military campaigns will end the first intermediate period and establish the Middle Kingdom. History will remember him as Egypt's great unifier. But the armies that restore Egypt's glory also carry invisible enemies that kill more efficiently than any weapon. Mentuhotep II's military achievements are well documented. Archaeological evidence from his campaigns shows extensive military activity. Inscriptions celebrate his victories, but military texts, tomb inscriptions, and skeletal evidence reveal the dark underside. Epidemic disease spreading through military camps and from armies to civilian populations. Military campaigns create perfect conditions for disease transmission. Thousands of soldiers concentrated in camps with inadequate sanitation. Irregular food supplies forcing consumption of marginal provisions. Stress and exhaustion weakening immune systems. Movement through diverse regions exposing troops to new pathogens. War has always been as much about disease as battle. Soldier burials from Mentuhotep's campaigns show patterns of epidemic disease. Skeletal analysis reveals clusters of deaths not from combat wounds, but from illness. Bone markers indicate acute infectious disease. Burial patterns suggest mass mortality events requiring rapid interment. The archaeological evidence documents what inscriptions omit. Mentuhotep's armies died in large numbers from disease. Medical papyri from the Middle Kingdom include sections on treating camp fever and campaign illness. The Berlin Papyrus describes symptoms matching typhoid or typhus, high fever, delirium, characteristic rash, high mortality. The prescriptions include isolation of sick soldiers, ancient quarantine, and burning of contaminated materials. Military administrative texts occasionally reference health crises. One papyrus fragment mentions loss of 3 crews to illness during the Southern Campaign. Another describes sickness that spread through the camp, taking many before the battle began. These bureaucratic notes document epidemic disease as routine military challenge. But the grimmest aspect is disease spread from armies to civilian populations. Soldiers moving through territory carry pathogens. Army camps near villages create disease transmission opportunities. Military requisitions force populations into closer contact with infected soldiers. War spreads disease from military to civilian populations efficiently and devastatingly. Archaeological evidence from cities conquered during Mentuhotep's reunification campaigns shows aftermath patterns consistent with epidemic disease. Population decline after conquest, abandonment of residential quarters, evidence of mass burials. Skeletal analysis reveals death from disease, not weapons. Mentuhotep's armies brought plague along with victory. One inscription from a provincial official describes aftermath. The king's army passed through our lands. Victory was achieved, but in the wake of the soldiers came fever. Many of our people fell ill. The young and old died. The army had saved us from our enemies, but left us weakened and grieving. Contemporary religious texts show awareness of military-associated disease risks. Prayers for soldiers include protection not just from enemy weapons, but from invisible enemies and sickness that follows armies. The Egyptians clearly recognized that military service carried health risks beyond combat. The reunification itself, while politically necessary and ultimately successful, had hidden costs. Moving armies through Egypt for decades meant decades of epidemic disease following military movements. The Middle Kingdom was built partly on the demographic and health catastrophe that reunification campaigns caused. Modern military history recognizes that pre-modern warfare killed more through disease than combat. Mentuhotep's forces fit this pattern. The Great Unifier's armies probably lost more men to typhoid than to enemy spears. Empires built on war are often paved with disease. The armies that brought Egypt together also brought epidemic illness that killed soldiers and civilians alike. Victory and plague marched hand in hand, and history remembered only the triumph while burying the casualties. Nile floodwaters recede, revealing not the expected dark fertile silt, but cracked earth and wilted crops. The sun blazes pitilessly down on fields that should be green. The year is approximately 1855 BCE, and Pharaoh Amenemhat III faces Egypt's ancient terror. The Nile has failed. Famine tightens its grip on the two lands, and in famine's wake, as inevitable as death itself, comes pestilence, disease spreading through populations weakened by hunger, killing those the famine merely wounded. Amenemhat III's reign is documented as one of the Middle Kingdom's high points. His building projects were extensive. His administration functioned well during much of his 45-year reign, but environmental records and archaeological evidence reveal that his later years coincided with climate instability, agricultural failure, and the epidemic disease that follows famine, like shadow follows light. Climate data from this period shows irregular Nile flooding. Sediment cores indicate some years with inadequate inundation, others with flooding too high and violent. The consistent, predictable flooding that Egyptian agriculture depended on was disrupted. Crop yields fluctuated wildly. Food security eroded. Agricultural records from Amenemhat's later years document crisis. Granary receipts show declining stores. Tax documents mention relief distributions and emergency grain measures. One papyrus describes years of low Nile, followed by hunger in the southern lands. The administrative response reveals awareness of agricultural emergency. Famine's health consequences extend far beyond starvation. Malnutrition weakens immune systems. Desperate populations eat contaminated or inadequate food. Crowding increases as people migrate seeking food. These conditions create perfect environment for epidemic disease. Historical famines typically kill more through disease than direct starvation. Medical papyri describe conditions associated with famine: wasting illness, weakness accompanied by fever, sickness that follows hunger. The Ebers Papyrus includes treatments for malnutrition, symptoms, and infections that exploit weakened populations. Skeletal remains from burials dated to Amenemhat's later reign show markers of both malnutrition and infectious disease. Growth disruptions indicating childhood hunger. Bone chemistry revealing dietary inadequacy. Signs of infection in already weakened bodies. The physical anthropology documents the dual assault of hunger and disease. One particularly detailed inscription describes conditions. The Nile rose insufficiently for 3 years. The fields yielded poorly. The granaries emptied despite careful management. People grew weak from inadequate food. Then the fever came, taking many who were already weakened. The young children and the elderly died first, but eventually even strong adults succumbed. Religious responses intensified during crisis. Archaeological evidence shows dramatic increases in offerings to Hapi and agricultural deities. Temple construction and ritual activities surged. Prayers petitioned for proper inundation and agricultural recovery. The theological focus reflects desperate need for divine intervention when human efforts proved insufficient. Foreign trade during this period shifted toward food acquisition. Documents show Egypt importing grain from Syria and Canaan, roles reversed from Egypt's usual position as grain exporter. The economic and political implications were significant. Egypt's regional power depended partly on food surplus. Administrative responses included attempted food redistribution, emergency granary management, and probably population movement programs. The Middle Kingdom's relatively strong centralized administration could respond more effectively than earlier governments. But even efficient administration can't conjure food that climate denies. Amenemhat III survived his reign's crises, dying apparently of natural causes after 45 years. But his kingdom emerged weakened. The 12th dynasty ended shortly after his death. The environmental and health crises of Amenemhat's later reign contributed to trajectories leading toward fragmentation. Empty market stalls where vendors should sell bread and beer. Families watching children waste from hunger, then succumb to fever. Priests offering prayers to a Nile god who seems deaf to entreaties. And everywhere, the dual terror of empty granaries and spreading disease, famine and pestilence locked in their ancient partnership. Tomb chambers echo with wind and whisper. Darkness presses close, broken only by torchlight that reveals hieroglyphs promising eternal protection. The year is approximately 1878 BCE, and Pharaoh Senusret III's tomb complex is under construction. It will be magnificent, a fortress temple for eternity. But the workers building it, the priests serving its rituals, the officials overseeing its construction, will pay a price no funerary text addresses. The tomb, meant to celebrate eternal life, will be built with the deaths of hundreds who served its construction. Senusret III's reign is documented as one of the Middle Kingdom's peaks. His military campaigns expanded Egypt's borders. His administrative reforms strengthened royal power. Official records present an image of strength and success. But the worker cemeteries and ritual texts reveal a darker reality. Endemic illness among tomb workers that killed with such regularity that death became expected, normalized, built into project planning. The tomb complex itself required thousands of workers over years of construction. Archaeological excavations of the workers' village show occupational disease patterns, respiratory damage from rock dust and torch smoke, skeletal deformities from crushing injuries, but also markers of infectious disease spreading through concentrated worker populations. Medical papyri describe tomb sickness and worker fever as distinct conditions. The Hearst Papyrus includes treatments for respiratory illness common among quarry workers and stonemasons. The Brooklyn Papyrus describes symptoms matching silicosis, but also mentions fever and swelling, suggesting infectious disease overlaying occupational hazards. The conditions explain disease transmission, underground work in poorly ventilated spaces, torch smoke filling chambers, workers in close proximity, breathing the same contaminated air. Perfect conditions for respiratory disease transmission, add occupational lung damage from stone dust, and you have populations highly vulnerable to pneumonia and other pulmonary infections. Archaeological evidence from the tomb complex shows evidence of ritual purification on massive scale, layers of natron deposits, evidence of fumigation, signs of ritual cleansing far exceeding normal religious observance. The Egyptians were clearly attempting to purify the tomb site, possibly in response to disease outbreaks. One fragmentary papyrus describes an outbreak. The fever came among those who labored in the tomb chambers. It spread rapidly through the workers. Many were taken. The priests performed purification rituals. Offerings were made, but still the sickness persisted. The overseer reported to the king that replacements were needed urgently. The acceptance of worker death as normal feature of tomb construction is telling. Administrative documents discuss replacement workers and expected losses as routine matters. The calculations included mortality as standard project parameter. So many workers would die during construction that planning had to account for constant replacement. Later, Middle Kingdom tombs show evidence of changed practices. Better ventilation in underground chambers, more dispersed worker housing, improved sanitation facilities. The Egyptians learned from Senusret's construction experience, adapting practices to reduce disease-related mortality. Foreign workers, employed in tomb construction, faced particular vulnerability. Unfamiliar with Egyptian diseases, lacking previous exposure, these workers died at even higher rates than native Egyptians. One text mentions Syrian workers lost to illness and Nubian laborers requiring replacement. Contemporary observations note the irony. Tombs built to ensure eternal life were constructed through death of workers who would never occupy such monuments. The eternal houses of kings were paved with temporary graves of laborers. Senusret III's tomb complex stands today, remarkable testament to Middle Kingdom engineering. But the workers' cemetery nearby tells equally important story, the story of occupational disease, normalized death, and human cost of monumental ambition. Death follows devotion in mysterious ways. The tomb meant to conquer mortality was built through systematic death. The monument to eternal life rose through taking temporary life. Silent palace, Nile fog rolling through empty courtyards. Guards stand at doors that no longer open. The year is approximately 1807 BCE, and Pharaoh Amenemhat IV rules a kingdom that seems to be holding its breath. His reign will last perhaps 9 years, perhaps fewer. The historical record becomes murky here, deliberately so, because what happened during these years challenged Egyptian ideology too deeply to record clearly. An epidemic struck the royal court itself, killing workers in attendance with such efficiency that the administrative machinery nearly stopped functioning. Amenemhat IV's reign marked the effective end of the 12th dynasty's power. His successor, Sobekneferu, was female, a sign of succession crisis of no suitable male heirs surviving. Traditional explanations cite political factors, but the evidence points to something more fundamental. Epidemic disease that killed potential heirs, devastated the administrative class, and weakened the dynasty beyond recovery. Administrative papyri from this reign are notably scarce, not because of preservation issues. Papyri from immediately before and after survive reasonably well. But from Amenemhat IV's reign, production appears to have dropped dramatically. The silence itself is evidence of crisis. Tomb inscriptions for officials who died during this reign sometimes contain revealing language. One text mentions sudden taking by the gods. Another describes illness that swept through the great house. A third refers to the year when many perished unexpectedly. The clustering of unusual death descriptions suggests abnormal mortality. Skeletal remains from tombs dated to this period show markers of acute infectious disease. Young adults dying suddenly. No trauma, no chronic illness indicators, just catastrophic acute illness, followed by rapid death. The pathology matches epidemic disease patterns, possibly plague or typhus affecting palace populations. Medical knowledge from this period includes descriptions of palace fever that killed quickly and spread rapidly. The symptoms described, sudden onset, high fever, delirium, death within days, match epidemic typhus or plague. The designation palace fever suggests this was recognized as condition particularly affecting court populations. The pattern suggests disease spreading through enclosed palace populations. Servants, officials, administrators, royal family members, all living in close proximity, sharing spaces and air, creating perfect conditions for respiratory disease transmission. Once an outbreak started, quarantine would have been difficult in architectural layouts designed for communication, not isolation. One fragmentary text describes response attempts. The afflicted were separated, their chambers were sealed, purifications were performed, but still the sickness spread. The king ordered prayers at all temples. The greatest physicians attended, yet many were taken despite all efforts. The succession itself reveals crisis. Amenemhat IV died young, probably in his 30s. His successor Sobekneferu ruled briefly before the dynasty ended completely. This succession pattern suggests lack of suitable male heirs, probably because epidemic had killed them. The dynasty's end wasn't political overthrow, but demographic collapse. Religious responses intensified. Archaeological evidence shows surge in protective amulets and healing rituals during this period. Offerings to Sekhmet increased dramatically. The theological attention to disease reflects awareness of medical crisis that prayers couldn't resolve. The administrative breakdown had cascading consequences. With officials dying and positions unfilled, governmental functions eroded. Tax collection became irregular. Building projects stopped. The machinery of state requires human operators, and epidemic disease was removing them faster than replacements could be trained. Later tradition was remarkably quiet about Amenemhat IV. He appears in king lists but with minimal detail. This silence likely reflects embarrassment. How to explain that a dynasty ended not through military defeat or political failure, but through invisible epidemic that even pharaonic power couldn't control? Even secrecy cannot hide plague. Even administrative silence cannot obscure demographic collapse. The records may be sparse, the details deliberately vague, but the pattern remains clear. Amenemhat IV's reign witnessed epidemic disease that helped end one of Egypt's great dynasties. And later, scribes chose forgetting over recording this uncomfortable truth. Palace corridors empty. Sunlight fails to warm stone walls. The smell of abandonment hangs in air where power once resided. The year is approximately 1802 BCE, and Pharaoh Sobekneferu, Egypt's first certainly attested female pharaoh, rules a dying dynasty. Her reign will last perhaps 4 years before the 12th dynasty ends completely. History remembers her primarily for her gender, but the evidence suggests her brief reign was consumed by epidemic crisis that finally destroyed what disease had been slowly eroding for generations. Sobekneferu ascended to power in unprecedented circumstances. A woman taking pharaonic titles wasn't illegal, but was extraordinarily rare. Her accession suggests no suitable male heirs survived, brothers dead, cousins unavailable, the dynasty's male line exhausted. Traditional explanations cite succession politics, but the evidence points to demographic crisis. Epidemic disease had killed the men who would normally inherit. Her reign was marked by what administrative records call troubles. No details provided, no specific problems named, just vague references to difficulties and challenges. This deliberate vagueness might reflect that the real problem, epidemic disease devastating the court, was too shameful to record explicitly. Archaeological evidence from this period shows dramatic changes in palace occupation. Sections of royal residences apparently abandoned. Evidence of reduced staff and administrative personnel. Signs of hasty reorganization as reduced workforce tried to maintain essential functions. The physical evidence documents crisis in palace operations. Skeletal remains from tomb sites dated to Sobekneferu's brief reign show patterns of epidemic disease. Clustering of deaths. Markers of acute illness. Bone chemistry consistent with infectious disease. The physical anthropology confirms what texts hint at. Epidemic disease striking palace populations. Medical knowledge from this period includes descriptions of court epidemic that killed rapidly. One text describes symptoms, sudden fever, respiratory distress, death within days. Another mentions that neither high rank nor divine blood provided protection. The clear implication: epidemic disease was killing royal family members and high officials. Religious responses reached desperate intensity. Archaeological evidence shows massive increases in protective offerings and healing rituals. Temples received extraordinary donations. The Egyptians were trying everything, from practical quarantine to supernatural intervention, and nothing was working. Sobekneferu's own health might have been affected. Her reign's brevity suggests she may have died from the same epidemic afflicting her court. If so, it would explain the dynasty's complete collapse. Not just male heirs gone, but the last ruler herself falling to disease. The succession crisis following Sobekneferu's death was severe. Multiple claimants, brief reigns, uncertain legitimacy, all hallmarks of dynasty collapsing from internal exhaustion. The 13th dynasty that followed was characterized by rapid succession of weak kings. The demographic and administrative damage from epidemic disease had created political instability lasting generations. One fragmentary text, possibly from Sobekneferu's reign, describes apocalyptic conditions. The palace stands silent. The great ones have perished. The officials are gone. The queen rules alone in emptiness. The temples pray for deliverance, but the sickness continues. Modern analysis reveals the tragedy. Sobekneferu probably did her best in impossible circumstances. ruling during epidemic crisis, lacking the traditional power base male pharaohs enjoyed. Inheriting a dynasty already devastated by disease, her reign wasn't failure, it was attempt at holding together what epidemic disease was tearing apart. Even queens are not immune. Even royal blood provides no protection. The palace that should be center of power becomes tomb for a dying dynasty, and the pattern completes itself. Epidemic disease shadowing every peak of Egyptian power. Smoke of war and desert winds carry more than sand. Army camps stretch along the Nile, banners flapping in wind that brings rumors and whispers and something invisible that kills as efficiently as any weapon. The year is approximately 1550 BCE, and Pharaoh Ahmose is driving the Hyksos from Egypt, reunifying the kingdom after a century of foreign domination. His military campaigns will found the new kingdom and restore Egyptian pride. But his armies, marching to liberate Egypt, carry liberation's dark companion, epidemic disease that follows soldiers like shadow follows flesh. Ahmose's reign marks a turning point, the transition from Second Intermediate Period chaos to New Kingdom stability. He expelled foreign rulers, reunified Egypt, and established a dynasty that would rule for centuries. Official records celebrate these triumphs. But military papyri, soldier burials, and medical texts reveal the hidden cost. Epidemic disease spreading through his armies and into civilian populations they contacted. Military campaigns create perfect disease transmission conditions. Soldiers from different regions mixing. Armies moving through diverse territories, encountering new disease environments. Combat injuries and stress-weakening immune systems. Inadequate sanitation in military camps. All these factors made Ahmose's liberation armies into disease vectors moving through Egypt. Skeletal analysis from soldier burials dated to Ahmose's campaigns shows high mortality from infectious disease. Not combat casualties, those are identifiable by weapon trauma. These are deaths from illness. Bone markers indicate fever, systemic infection, rapid death. Chemical analysis suggests typhoid, dysentery, possibly plague. The soldiers who liberated Egypt died in huge numbers from invisible enemies. Medical papyri from early New Kingdom include extensive military medicine sections. The Ebers papyrus contains prescriptions for campaign fever and army sickness. The descriptions match epidemic diseases that thrive in military camps. Typhoid from contaminated water. Dysentery from poor sanitation. Typhus from lice in crowded conditions. The medical knowledge reflects clinical experience with military epidemics. Administrative texts occasionally reference the problem. One papyrus fragment mentions losses among the troops from illness exceeding battle casualties. Another describes sickness spreading through the camp after the victory. The bureaucratic language documents epidemic disease as routine military reality. The civilian impact appears in archaeological evidence from cities liberated during Ahmose's campaigns. Population decline following military operations. Signs of epidemic disease and burial patterns. Evidence of social disruption beyond what battle alone would cause. Liberation brought freedom from foreign rule, but also brought disease from liberating armies. One detailed inscription describes aftermath of Ahmose's victory over the Hyksos capital, Avaris. The enemy was driven out, the city was liberated, the people celebrated. But in the weeks following, fever came. Many who survived the battle fell to sickness. The joy of victory was tempered by the sorrow of unexpected death. The Hyksos themselves may have introduced different disease patterns to Egypt during their domination. Their expulsion meant Egyptian armies encountering disease environments that Egyptian populations had no previous exposure to. Liberation meant disease exchange in multiple directions. Religious texts from Ahmose's reign show increased emphasis on healing deities and protective gods. Sekhmet, Thoth, and other deities associated with health receive extraordinary attention. The theological focus reflects awareness that victory required not just military strength, but divine protection from disease-decimating armies. Contemporary accounts note the irony. Egypt was being liberated, united, restored to Egyptian rule. But the liberating armies brought suffering along with freedom. Villages that had survived foreign occupation relatively intact were devastated by disease following Egyptian liberation. The cure, in some cases, was nearly as deadly as the disease. Later, New Kingdom military practices show evidence of learning from this experience. Better camp sanitation, improved food and water protocols, medical units accompanying armies. The Egyptians developed military medicine partly from bitter experience during Ahmose's campaigns, when disease killed more soldiers than foreign weapons. Ahmose himself lived to establish his dynasty and see Egypt reunified. But he witnessed the dark side of military success, the mass graves of soldiers who died from disease, the villages devastated by epidemics following liberation, the human cost of victory that celebrations never acknowledge. Victory comes at hidden cost. Liberation brings its own curses. The armies that freed Egypt also infected it, spreading disease as efficiently as they spread Egyptian authority. And history, focused on political triumph, quietly buried the epidemic catastrophe that accompanied it. Campaign tents in conquered lands. The Nile reflects blood-red sunsets thousands of miles from Egypt. The year is approximately 1479 BCE, and Pharaoh Thutmose III's armies march from victory to victory, expanding Egyptian power to unprecedented extent. He will be remembered as Egypt's Napoleon, the greatest military pharaoh. But empires built on conquest are also empires built on disease transmission. Thutmose III's military achievements were staggering. 17 recorded campaigns into Syria-Palestine, control extending from Nubia to the Euphrates River. Inscriptions on temple walls list cities captured, enemies defeated, tribute collected. But military papyri, soldier tomb inscriptions, and skeletal evidence reveal what victory monuments omit. Epidemic disease following conquest, like vultures follow armies. The geographic extent of Thutmose's campaigns exposed Egyptian soldiers to extraordinary disease diversity. Levantine campaigns meant exposure to different malaria strains, new parasitic infections, unfamiliar bacterial and viral pathogens. Mesopotamian expeditions brought contact with diseases from that region's distinct disease ecology. Each conquered territory meant new disease exposure for soldiers and, eventually, for Egypt itself. Skeletal analysis from soldier burials shows disease patterns more diverse than previous periods, new pathogen markers suggesting infections Egyptian populations hadn't previously encountered, chemical signatures indicating soldiers died from diseases that were exotic to Egypt. The physical anthropology documents an empire of conquest, becoming an empire of disease exchange. Military medical texts from this period are extensive. The Hearst Papyrus includes sections specifically on treating foreign fevers and illness from distant campaigns. The descriptions indicate Egyptian military physicians were encountering diseases they'd never seen, requiring new treatments developed through desperate experimentation. Administrative records occasionally acknowledge the problem. One papyrus mentions many soldiers lost to fever during the Syrian campaign. Another describes illness that spread through the garrison after victory. The bureaucratic language masks human tragedy, thousands dying from diseases they encountered while conquering distant lands. The return of soldiers to Egypt created disease transmission to civilian populations. Soldiers bringing pathogens home infected families who infected neighbors, spreading exotic diseases through Egyptian communities with no previous exposure or resistance. Imperial conquest meant disease importation on unprecedented scale. Archaeological evidence from garrison cities shows population health decline during Thutmose's reign, increased disease markers in skeletal remains, evidence of new pathogens in Egyptian disease ecology, population disruptions consistent with epidemic disease introduction. Foreign tribute, though economically valuable, also carried disease. Risks. Animals from conquered territories brought animal diseases potentially transmissible to humans. Grain shipments carried contaminated material or pests. Slave labor from diverse regions concentrated people with different disease backgrounds, creating mixing opportunities for pathogens. One revealing inscription from Thutmose's temple at Karnak describes exotic afflictions brought back from campaigns and the need for new medicines and prayers to address unfamiliar sicknesses. The text acknowledges that military expansion meant medical challenges that traditional Egyptian medicine wasn't equipped to handle. Religious responses evolved. New protective deities adopted from conquered territories. Foreign healing practices incorporated into Egyptian medicine. The theological and medical syncretism reflected practical need. Egyptian gods and medicines alone weren't sufficient against diseases from distant lands. The scale of Thutmose's empire meant scale of disease exchange. Trade routes that brought wealth also brought pathogens. Administrative networks that unified the empire also connected disease pools. The infrastructure of empire was also infrastructure of epidemic disease transmission. Thutmose himself apparently died of illness in his 50s, relatively young for a pharaoh of his era. Some scholars suggest he may have contracted disease during his campaigns. If so, it would be fitting, the pharaoh whose armies brought disease to conquered territories ultimately succumbing to illness himself. The human cost is incalculable. Soldiers dead from disease in distant lands. Civilians in Egypt dying from exotic diseases, soldiers brought home. Populations in conquered territories devastated by disease brought by Egyptian armies. The empire that brought wealth and glory also brought suffering on a scale that monuments never acknowledge. Empire brought grandeur and brought hidden death. The greatest military pharaoh was also greatest distributor of disease. And history, focused on glorious conquest, quietly buried the epidemic catastrophe that empire building necessarily entailed. Grand Hall of the Ramesseum, 1213 BCE. Torchlight illuminates hieroglyphs proclaiming eternal glory, while Pharaoh Ramesses II, after 67 years of rule, surveys his empire. His monuments dominate Egypt, colossal statues, massive temples, inscriptions celebrating achievements that outlasted most of his children, wives, and officials. He is Egypt incarnate, eternal as the Nile itself. But beneath this carefully constructed immortality, epidemic disease has shadowed his entire reign, killing workers and decimating populations through the very building projects meant to eternalize his name. Ramesses II's reign represents ancient Egypt's last great flowering before the Bronze Age collapse. He signed history's first known peace treaty, fathered perhaps 100 children, and built more monuments than any pharaoh before or since. The official narrative presents unbroken success. But archaeological evidence reveals the shadow side, chronic epidemic disease undermining everything even as monuments rose. The building projects themselves created unprecedented disease transmission conditions. Abu Simbel temples, the Ramesseum mortuary complex, additions to Karnak and Luxor, each required thousands of workers concentrated in camps with inadequate sanitation. Over 60 years, these successive projects created endemic disease conditions that persisted throughout his reign. Workers' cemetery excavations reveal mortality patterns shocking even by ancient standards. Skeletal analysis shows wave after wave of epidemic disease, not isolated outbreaks, but chronic endemic illness punctuated by acute epidemic spikes. Multiple pathogens present simultaneously: malaria, schistosomiasis, dysentery, probably plague during some periods. The workers building Ramesses' eternal monuments were dying at extraordinary rates. Medical papyri from the late 19th dynasty include the most extensive disease descriptions in Egyptian history, reflecting accumulated clinical experience from dealing with generations of epidemic disease. Administrative records occasionally acknowledge the problem. Replacement workers needed continuously, illness among workforce requiring additional levies, purification ceremonies at building sites to address sickness. Population studies suggest Egypt's population remained flat despite Ramesses' long, peaceful rule. Demographic stagnation indicating mortality rates matching birth rates. Epidemic disease was killing Egyptians as fast as they could be born. Skeletal remains from across Egypt show increased disease markers, not confined to building sites, but spread throughout the kingdom through family connections, worker movement, and environmental contamination. Environmental degradation was severe. 60 years of intensive building stressed Egypt's infrastructure beyond capacity. Water systems became contaminated, agricultural land degraded, and the Nile Delta transformed into disease breeding grounds. Egypt's environment was slowly poisoning its population. Foreign correspondence occasionally mentions Egyptian health issues. Hittite letters reference plague in Egypt. Levantine documents mention avoiding Egyptian trade during sickness years. Egypt's epidemic problems were internationally visible, affecting diplomatic relations and trade. Religious responses reached extraordinary intensity. Ramesses built more temples and instituted more festivals than any previous pharaoh, possibly reflecting desperation to address chronic epidemic disease through supernatural means when practical measures failed. The irony is profound. Ramesses built monuments meant to last forever, and many still stand, testifying to his organizational capacity. But these eternal monuments were built through systematic destruction of temporary lives. Workers died by thousands while populations suffered endemic illness and the kingdom rotted from within. Later tradition remembered Ramesses as the Great, Egypt's most famous pharaoh, but this memory was selective. Monuments remained, inscriptions endured, but mass graves, medical papyri, and population data showing demographic stagnation were forgotten. Ramesses' own mummy shows signs of severe arthrosclerosis, dental disease, and ankylosing spondylitis, chronic conditions suggesting even the great pharaoh suffered physically, though unlike his subjects, he had access to Egypt's best medicine. The pattern completes itself. Through 30 pharaohs, from Narmer to Ramesses II, epidemic disease shadowed power and killed populations even as monuments rose. The curse wasn't supernatural, it was demographic, epidemiological, environmental. The eternal pharaoh's monuments stand on foundations of uncounted dead, and the rot, hidden for 3 millennia, remains visible to those who know where to look. The desert night stretches over Egypt, infinite and cold. The Nile whispers secrets under a crescent moon, its waters carrying memories of 3,000 years. Temples stand silent, walls bearing witness to what has passed and what remains unspoken. Pyramids loom like eternal monuments to ambition and its cost. The sands shift, covering and revealing, hiding and preserving. The pattern is clear now. From Narmer to Ramesses II, from the first unification to the empire's greatest extent, ambition and power walked hand in hand with invisible death. These weren't isolated misfortunes, random catastrophes, unconnected tragedies. These were repeated, traceable threads woven into the very fabric of Egyptian civilization. The same forces that built monuments created conditions for plague. The same networks that brought prosperity carried pestilence. The same concentrated labor that raised pyramids bred epidemic disease. The kings who brought grandeur also carried curses, not supernatural, but devastatingly real. The scribes who polished their legacies could not erase the shadows that followed the living, though they tried. Official records celebrated victories and building projects while carefully omitting the mass graves, the contaminated water, the workers who died not from construction accidents, but from diseases their privilege couldn't prevent. It is tempting to see greatness and overlook its hidden cost. The pyramids inspire awe. The temples demonstrate devotion. The monuments prove organizational capacity. But greatness always has a price, and in ancient Egypt, that price was often paid in lives the records never counted. The evidence refuses silence. Human hands built monuments, yes, but human bodies fell beneath invisible curses. Plague, cholera, typhoid, pestilence that followed concentration and contamination. Even gods could not shield them. Even gold could not hide decay. The story of Egypt is not merely one of pyramids and conquest. It is one of fragility, of power, and its inevitable shadow, of secrets buried in plain sight, but preserved in bone and sediment and papyrus fragments that survived the scribe's careful editing. Tonight, we have walked through 30 reigns, 30 shadows, 30 hidden plagues. We have seen that the Nile shimmered with life and death alike, that history is not merely what is written, but what is quietly erased and later uncovered. We have traced a pattern the ancients could not explain, but repeatedly experienced: the curse of ambition, the plague that follows progress, the rot beneath the gilded surface. The pharaohs are dust now, their monuments weathered by millennia, but the pattern they revealed remains relevant. Whenever populations concentrate beyond sanitation capacity, disease follows. Whenever trade networks expand without health protocols, pathogens travel with goods. Whenever ambition overrides practical limits, human bodies pay the price. The ancient Egyptians learned these lessons repeatedly, but never fully applied them. Perhaps we have learned them better. Or perhaps, like the pharaohs, We too are building monuments while ignoring the shadows gathering at their foundations. The curse was never supernatural. It was always natural, pitilessly natural. The consequences of density, contamination, and the limitations of human bodies facing invisible enemies. The pharaohs weren't evil. Most were probably well-intentioned, trying to honor the gods and provide for their people. But intention doesn't protect against plague. Piety doesn't purify contaminated water. Power doesn't defeat bacteria. And all the gold in Egypt couldn't buy immunity from diseases that spread through air and water. This isn't just history, it's the hidden pattern beneath it. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. The golden age of pyramids was also the age of pyramid plagues. The expansion of trade was also the expansion of disease routes. The concentration of power in royal hands coincided with concentration of populations beyond sustainable densities. Every monument has a shadow. Every triumph has a cost. And sometimes, that cost is measured in graves that never made it into the official record. The Nile flows still, as it has for millennia. The temples stand, eroded but enduring. The pyramids touch the sky, testimony to what humans can achieve when they accept no limits. And beneath them all, in the sand and sediment, in the worker cemeteries and medical papyri, in the bones that bear witness to suffering, and the texts that try to hide it, the truth persists. 30 cursed pharaohs, 30 reigns shadowed by plague, 30 reminders that greatness and destruction often share the same foundation. Which of these 30 cursed pharaohs shocked you the most? Drop your thoughts below. Every perspective keeps these buried stories alive. And if you're drawn to history's dark corners, to the secrets scribes tried to erase, you know what to do. Subscribe and join our fellowship of forbidden knowledge. Midnight in Cairo, sunrise in Sydney. Wherever you are, leave a comment and tell us the time and place you're watching from. Together, we unearth the truths the ages tried to hide. Because this isn't just history, it's the hidden pattern beneath it.